There is a man in New York City that entire crime families whisper about in dark rooms with the doors locked. Rafael DeLuca has never raised his voice at an enemy. He doesn't need to. He simply looks at them, and they understand exactly what comes next. 14 secretaries have walked out of his office in the past 8 months. 3 of them cried. 1 fainted in the elevator on the way down. So when a clumsy, overweight 26-year-old named Molly Bennett walked in and immediately poured boiling espresso all over his $10,000 Italian suit, nobody expected her to survive the morning. Nobody expected him to let her stay. And nobody, not his soldiers, not his enemies, not even Rafael himself, expected what happened next. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, settle in. This one is going to take everything you've got. The elevator doors opened on the 43rd floor, and Molly Bennett already knew she was going to be late. Not by much. 4 minutes, maybe 5. Depending on how fast she could walk in heels she had no business wearing. She'd bought them 3 days ago at a discount rack on Canal Street. Black, sensible looking from a distance. Absolute instruments of destruction up close. Because the ad had said professional appearance required, and her only other option was a pair of scuffed brown flats with a crack along the left sole that let in rainwater. It had rained this morning. She'd worn the heels. The 43rd floor of DeLuca International Holdings smelled like money in the way that only certain places did. Not the smell of bills or coins, but something deeper and colder, like mahogany and climate control, and the particular silence of people who never had to raise their voices to be obeyed. The carpet under Molly's feet was the color of charcoal, and so thick she could feel her ankles threatening to buckle with every step. The walls were pale gray with recessed lighting that cast no shadows. There were no photographs, no plants, no decorations of any kind except for a single, large, abstract painting at the far end of the reception area. Black on black, shapes that almost became faces if you stared too long. Molly did not stare too long. She had a job interview to survive. The receptionist behind the front desk was a woman somewhere between 35 and ageless, with the kind of posture that suggested she had been assembled rather than born. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it looked like it hurt. She looked at Molly the way customs agents looked at luggage they'd already decided to search. "Molly Bennett," Molly said before the woman could say anything. "I have a 9 o'clock. I know I'm a little—" "You're 4 minutes late." "I know. The elevator—" "There are 4 elevators." Molly pressed her lips together. "Right, I'm sorry. Am I still being seen?" The receptionist's expression didn't change. She lifted a phone receiver, said 3 words into it that Molly couldn't quite hear, and set it down again. "Someone will come for you. Wait there." She gestured at a row of chairs along the wall. They were low and angular and looked like they had been designed specifically to make the person sitting in them feel smaller than they already felt. Molly sat. She spent the next 6 minutes looking at her hands in her lap. Her resume was in a folder inside her bag. A black portfolio she'd found at the bottom of a closet, slightly creased along one corner, which she'd spent 20 minutes trying to flatten with a warm iron the night before. It was mostly flat now. Mostly. She'd also spent 40 minutes last night reading everything publicly available about DeLuca International Holdings, which wasn't much. The company had a website that was mostly stock imagery and vague language about global logistics solutions. There were no employee testimonials, no press releases more recent than 18 months ago, no social media presence of any kind. What there was a salary offer that had made Molly read the job listing 3 times to make sure she hadn't misread it. She had not misread it. It was more than twice what she'd been making at her last position. Enough to cover the back rent she owed on her apartment. 2 months, with a third coming due in 11 days. Enough to pay down the credit card she'd been treating like a slow-moving disaster for the past year. Enough, if she was careful, to actually build a small cushion of savings for the first time in her adult life. She needed this job. She needed it in the specific, grinding, unglamorous way that people needed things when the alternative was watching their life come apart at the seams. "Ms. Bennett?" She stood up so fast the portfolio slid off her lap and hit the floor. The man who had come for her was in his mid-30s, slim, dark suit, the particular blankness of expression that suggested he had been working in this building long enough to have learned that facial expressions were a liability. He looked at the portfolio on the floor, then at Molly, then picked it up himself and handed it to her. "Thank you," Molly said. "Sorry, Thank you." He didn't respond. He just turned and walked, and she followed him down a hallway that felt 3 times longer than it looked. They stopped at a set of double doors at the end of the hall. The man knocked twice, opened the door without waiting for a response, and stepped aside to let Molly through. The office on the other side of those doors was the largest private workspace Molly had ever stood inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 walls, looking out over lower Manhattan in the gray morning light. A desk in the center of the room, dark wood, enormous, completely clear except for a laptop, a phone, and a small espresso cup sitting at the right-hand corner. Bookshelves built into the opposite wall, every shelf full, every volume arranged with a precision that looked almost compulsive. And behind the desk, Rafael De Luca. She'd looked him up, of course. There were photographs available, so not many, but a few, mostly from business events where he appeared on the periphery of other people's pictures, slightly blurred, as though the camera itself wasn't sure it had permission. In those photographs, he'd looked imposing but abstract, the way powerful men often looked in photographs, composed and distant and essentially decorative. In person, he was something else entirely. He was sitting very still, reading something on his laptop screen, and he did not look up when she entered. He was not especially large, medium height, lean rather than broad, somewhere in his late 30s, but there was something about the quality of his stillness that made the room feel smaller, like the air in the space had reorganized itself around him and was waiting for instruction. Molly took 2 steps into the room. 3. "Sit," he said, without looking up. She sat in the chair across from the desk. He finished reading whatever he was reading. He closed the laptop. He looked at her. His eyes were the color of dark water, not brown, not quite gray, something in between, cold in the way that deep places were cold. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, with total attention and no warmth whatsoever. "Molly Bennett," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "You were 4 minutes late." "I know, I'm sorry, She stopped herself from explaining. Explanations were a form of begging, and she'd promised herself on the elevator up that she wasn't going to beg. "It won't happen again." Something in his expression didn't change exactly, but shifted slightly, like a card being turned over. He picked up a single sheet of paper from beside the laptop, her resume, she realized, which must have been sent ahead somehow, and looked at it. "You were at Harbridge and Cole for 3 years." "Yes." "You were let go." "Yes." "Why?" Not a question either. Molly held herself very still. "The company restructured. My entire department was eliminated." He looked at her. "That's what it says on your resume." "It's what happened." 6 weeks ago." "Yes." "And in 6 weeks you haven't found another position." She didn't answer that immediately because the honest answer was complicated. She had applied to 41 jobs in 6 weeks. She had received 4 interviews. She had made it to the final round of 2 of them and had been passed over both times for candidates who were described in the carefully worded rejection emails as slightly more aligned with their current needs. She had a theory about what those words meant. She'd had that theory for most of her adult life. "I found this one," she said. Rafael De Luca looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down the resume. "Tell me about the Harbridge and Cole accounting irregularities," he said. Molly blinked. "I'm sorry?" 6 months before you were let go, the firm filed amended tax returns for 2 consecutive quarters. The corrections reduced their reported operating expenses by 11%. This followed an internal audit that lasted approximately 3 weeks and resulted in 2 senior accountants leaving the company. He paused. Their official exits were framed as voluntary departures for personal reasons. The room was very quiet. Molly said carefully, "I'm not sure what you're asking me. I'm asking whether you were the one who found the discrepancy." She looked at him. He looked back. His expression was completely unreadable. "How do you know about that?" she said. It came out flatter than she intended, less like a question and more like a statement of the problem. "I do thorough background research on candidates." That information was internal. It was never... She stopped. "That information was supposed to be confidential." "Yes," he said. It was. A beat of silence that stretched until it had edges. Yes, Molly said. I found it. I was cross-referencing vendor invoices against payment records, and I found a pattern that didn't add up. I flagged it to my direct supervisor. She stopped. And I was told to refile it under a different category and not mention it again. She took a breath. So I mentioned it again, directly to the compliance officer. Another breath. 3 weeks later, my entire department was eliminated in a restructuring. Raphael said nothing for a moment. He picked up the espresso cup from the corner of his desk and turned it once in his fingers, slowly, like he was considering something. You cost yourself your job, he said, to report a financial irregularity that was then corrected anyway. I cost myself my job, Molly said, because I was right. He looked at her again, really looked at her, in a way that felt different from how he'd been looking at her before, more direct, more specific, like he was reading something in her face that he hadn't expected to find there. Then he picked up the phone on his desk and said, quietly, to whoever answered, "Send in coffee." He set the phone down. "The position requires discretion," he said. "It requires precision. The previous 13 individuals in this role were terminated or resigned within 45 days of starting. One lasted 6 days. I read that the turnover was high," Molly said carefully. "That's a diplomatic characterization." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "I'm not an easy employer, Ms. Bennett. I have specific standards. I expect them to be met. I do not explain myself more than once." "I understand. I don't think you do yet. But you will, within the first week, if you last that long." He said it without cruelty, but also without softness. Just fact, delivered in the flat register of a man who had no particular investment in sugarcoating. "I am also going to tell you something that I do not say to candidates during interviews as a matter of general policy. But your situation warrants clarity." Molly waited. "This company has operations that are sensitive in nature," he said. "You will have access to financial records, schedules, and correspondence that cannot leave this building and cannot be discussed outside of it. What you encounter in this role will sometimes raise questions. I'm telling you now. Do not ask them." It was a strange thing to say. It was a very strange thing to say in a job interview, and Molly's mind turned it over carefully, looking at it from different angles. "I'm very good at keeping confidences," she said. "I know," he said. "I know because you kept the Harbridge matter inside the company rather than going to external regulators, despite having every reason to." He paused. That choice showed either extraordinary loyalty or extraordinary pragmatism. "I'm curious which it was." "Pragmatism?" Molly said, without hesitating. "I needed a reference." Something crossed his face so fast she almost missed it. That might have been the faintest possible beginning of a smile, or might have been nothing at all. The door opened. A young man came in carrying a tray. On the tray was a fresh espresso and a small plate with a biscotti. He set it on the far corner of the desk. He was moving to leave when the rug, the thick, expensive, impeccably maintained rug that covered most of the office floor, betrayed Molly in the way that rugs had been betraying her for her entire life. She had shifted in her chair to let the young man pass. Her right heel caught the edge of the rug. She reached out instinctively to catch herself, and her hand connected with the corner of the desk, and the tray skated sideways, and the espresso, full, fresh, practically steaming, launched off the tray in a clean arc and landed directly on Raphael DeLuca's chest. The silence that followed was so complete and so sudden that it had a physical quality, like pressure. Molly was on her feet. She didn't remember standing. She was standing. Raphael DeLuca was sitting very still, looking down at the spreading dark stain across the front of his white shirt and the lapel of his suit jacket, which was pale gray and now was not. The young man with the tray had gone white as bone. "I am so sorry," Molly said. Her voice was very steady, which surprised her, because her entire body was not. I'll pay for the suit. I don't know what it costs, but I'll sell things. I'll pay for it." She was aware, distantly, that this was not the most professional thing she could have said. Raphael DeLuca looked up from his suit. He looked at her. His face was still completely, eerily composed. No rage, no color in his cheeks, just those dark eyes and the stillness. "Sell things," he repeated. "If I have to, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the young man, who was still standing frozen near the door. "Get me a shirt from the car," Raphael said, "and clean up the tray." The young man left so fast he was almost running. Molly was still standing. Her heart was doing something desperate and irregular inside her chest. She was calculating exit routes without meaning to. "Sit down," Raphael said. She sat. He was still looking at her. The stain on his shirt had expanded. He didn't seem to notice or care. He was watching her the way she imagined a person watched something they were trying to categorize, something that didn't fit the existing system. "You're terrified," he said. "Yes. But you're still sitting in that chair." She looked at him. "You told me to sit." Another one of those almost moments. Something that wasn't quite expression moving through his face like a ripple across dark water. "The job pays $140,000 base," he said, "plus performance bonuses at my discretion, which can add another 20 to 40%. You'll have access to a company card for work-related expenses. Hours are variable. You will be on call at all hours of the day, including weekends. You will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement before you leave today." He paused. "The suit is Brioni. It costs more than your monthly rent. Consider the cost absorbed." Molly's mouth was slightly open. She closed it. "I'm offering you the position," he said, and it was flat and factual, without the traditional ceremony of such things. No congratulations, no warmth, no handshake offered across the desk. Just the information, delivered like a directive. "Why?" she said. It came out before she could stop it, and she watched him look at her. Surprised, maybe, or something closer to interest. "Because you told me you were pragmatic," he said, "and then you offered to sell your belongings to cover a stranger's damages. That's not pragmatism." He picked up a pen from the desk, turned it once in his fingers. "I want to see which one is real." Her first 2 weeks at DeLuca International were an education in the specific texture of being perpetually, profoundly out of your depth. The office ran on rhythms she couldn't immediately decode. There were 12 other employees on the 43rd floor. She was given a brief tour by a woman named Kara, who had a voice like gravel and seemed to regard Molly with an expression balanced exactly between curiosity and pity. The other staff moved through the space with the careful, deliberate quiet of people who had learned that noise attracted attention, and that attention in this building was not always comfortable. Molly's workspace was the desk just outside Raphael's office, close enough to hear his phone calls if he raised his voice, which he almost never did, and close enough that he could open his door and look at her without crossing any significant distance, which he did, often. He never explained what he was looking for when he looked. He would open the door, glance at her, and go back inside. Or he would open the door and say, "Come," without specifying why, and she would gather her notepad and follow him inside, where he would dictate 3 or 4 directives in rapid succession without apparent concern for whether she was keeping up. She kept up. That, she could feel, surprised him. Not in any way he acknowledged or demonstrated, but she had the distinct impression, based on 6 years of working in rooms where she was underestimated so consistently that it had become a kind of professional weather, that he had not expected her to keep up. She also reorganized his filing system in the first week. She hadn't planned to. She'd been retrieving a set of vendor contracts on his instruction and noticed that the current filing structure, by date of execution, subdivided by company name, made it nearly impossible to quickly cross-reference against payment records. She'd rebuilt the structure in her head while eating lunch at her desk, and then, on a Thursday afternoon while Raphael was in a meeting that ran long, she'd quietly done it. He noticed immediately. He came back into the outer office, stopped at her desk, and said, "You moved the Castellano files." "I reorganized the whole vendor archive," she said. "I kept all the original dates in the metadata so nothing is lost. But now the primary sort is by contract type and secondary by region, and there's a master cross-reference index for payment reconciliation." She'd made a 1-page summary of the new structure, and she slid it across the desk toward him. "I wrote it up if you want to review the logic." He picked up the 1-page summary. He read it. He set it down. "Do the same thing with the subsidiary records," he said, and went back into his office. It was the closest thing to approval she'd received since she'd started. The clumsiness did not improve. If anything, the stress of the new environment seemed to amplify it. She knocked over a display of architectural models on her 3rd day. An entire scale replica of what appeared to be a warehouse complex scattered across the lobby floor, before she could catch a single piece. She tripped on the lobby stairs on day 5 and was caught by one of the large, expressionless men who inhabited the periphery of the building in a way she hadn't yet fully understood. Not security guards exactly, not office workers exactly, just men who were present, who watched, and who apparently reflexively caught falling secretaries. She destroyed a printer on day 8. She still wasn't entirely sure how. Each incident sent a wave of cold through her that started in her chest and radiated outward. Each time she waited for the directive, the quiet, toneless instruction to collect her things. Each time, it didn't come. On day 11, she found the irregularity. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been doing a routine reconciliation of subsidiary expense reports, the kind of grinding, detail-intensive work that most people found stupefying and that Molly found almost meditative. When she noticed that 3 separate subsidiaries had been making payments to the same external consulting firm over an 18-month period, with the payments coded under 3 completely different expense categories on each subsidiary's books. In isolation, each entry was unremarkable. In aggregate, they added up to just under $4 million, spread thin enough across enough categories and enough time that it would take someone specifically looking for it to see it. Molly had not been specifically looking for it. She stared at her screen for a long time. Then she pulled the external consulting firm's registration records, publicly available, technically, though buried, and found that the firm had been incorporated 14 months ago, had 1 registered employee, and had a listed business address that matched a residential property in Queens. She printed everything out. She put it in a folder. She held the folder in her hands for a moment and thought, with a very specific and unpleasant clarity, about her last job. Then she got up and knocked on Raphael's door. "Come." She went in. He was on the phone. He looked at her, held up 1 finger. "Wait," and finished the call in approximately 40 seconds in a language she thought might be Italian, though she wasn't certain. He set the phone down. "I found something," she said. She put the folder on his desk. He opened it. He looked at the first page, then the second. Then he went through the rest of them one at a time, and his face was, as always, completely still. But she had been watching him closely enough over 11 days that she had begun to learn the difference between his stillnesses. This one was different from the ordinary kind. This one had tension in it, concentrated somewhere below the surface. He closed the folder. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." "Sit down, Molly." First name. She sat. "How long have you known about this?" he said. "About 40 minutes. I found it in the subsidiary reconciliation. I printed it as soon as I mapped the pattern." "Did you tell anyone else?" "No." "Did you make copies?" "That's the only copy." He was quiet for a moment. "This firm," he said. "The registered entity. Do you know who it belongs to?" She looked at him steadily. "I have a theory, but I don't know enough to confirm it." "Your theory?" "I think it belongs to someone inside this company," she said. "The payments are structured to avoid any single quarter threshold that would trigger automatic review. That's not amateur work. Someone with access to the internal review protocols built this." She paused. "Or someone who was told about the review protocols by someone with access." Raphael looked at her for a long time. "You understand," he said, "that you've just discovered something very sensitive." "I'm starting to understand that sensitive means something specific in this office," she said. "More specific than it does in most offices. And you came directly to me. You told me on my first day. If something raises questions, bring it to you." He was quiet. Outside the windows, the city went about its business 43 floors below, indifferent and enormous. "There's a man named Gerard Thibault," Raphael said finally. "He runs our finance subsidiary in Montreal. He's been with this company for 9 years. He has a wife, 2 children, and a mortgage on a house in Westchester that is, by the numbers, slightly beyond what his salary should support." He picked up the folder from his desk and set it to the right of the laptop, precisely parallel to the edge of the desk. "He doesn't know that I know about the house. Or about this." He looked at her. "Now you know." Molly said nothing. "The question," Raphael continued, "is what to do about a man who has been trusted for 9 years and has been stealing for at least 18 months, possibly longer." That's not really my question to answer, Molly said. No, he said. It isn't. He held her gaze. But the fact that you found it in 40 minutes, when it had survived 2 full internal audits, is a fact that I'm going to be thinking about. She went back to her desk. She sat there for a while, looking at her screen without seeing it, thinking about what kind of company had operations sensitive in nature, and a finance director quietly bleeding it from the inside, and a man running it who had the particular stillness of someone who dealt with problems in ways that did not necessarily involve lawyers. She thought about her rent. She thought about 3 months of back payments and 11 days to the third one coming due. She opened the next batch of subsidiary files and went back to work. Over the following 3 weeks, Molly built a picture of the office the way she built everything, detail by detail, pattern by pattern, with the slow and slightly obsessive attention that had made her very good at her job and somewhat difficult to make small talk with at parties. There were 12 people on the 43rd floor. Of those 12, she identified 3 categories. The first category, about half, were ordinary office workers in the way that she was an ordinary office worker. People who handled specific administrative or financial functions and didn't look too hard at anything that wasn't directly in front of them. The second category were the men in the periphery, 6 of them, rotating in pairs, who arrived when Raphael arrived and left when he left, and whose job descriptions, as far as she could determine, did not appear anywhere in any organizational chart. The third category was Raphael. He was not like the other people in the building. She had known this from the moment she walked into his office, but knowing it and understanding it were different things, and over those 3 weeks she began to develop the particular uncomfortable understanding of a person who has been paying close attention to something that doesn't entirely add up. The phone calls in what she was now fairly confident was Italian, sometimes, and occasionally in Spanish. The men who came to meetings that weren't on any calendar she had access to, arriving through the building's private elevator, faces she didn't recognize, dressed in suits that were expensive in a way that wasn't corporate. The way every person in the building, without exception, responded to Raphael's presence with a shift in posture, a recalibration of the body's center of gravity. That was not the way people responded to their bosses. It was the way people responded to something they were afraid of. She filed this away. She kept her head down. She did her work, which she was very good at, and she did not ask questions. Gerard Thibault arrived from Montreal on a Wednesday and left Thursday morning. She didn't see him. He met with Raphael in the office while she was in the records room downstairs. But on Thursday afternoon, when she pulled up the Montreal subsidiary's accounts to do the regular reconciliation, the consulting firm's billing account no longer existed. It had been closed, with a backdating notation that placed the closure 14 months earlier. The $4 million was simply gone from the records, the way a water stain disappears when the wall is repainted, smooth and seamless and completely untraceable. She thought about Gerard Thibault and his house in Westchester. She didn't ask any questions. 3 days later, Raphael set a small white paper bag on her desk without comment and walked into his office. Inside the bag were 2 croissants from a bakery on West 50th that she had mentioned once in passing to Kara during a lunch break as her favorite. She had said it the way you said things in passing, not intending anyone in particular to hear, not directing it at anyone. She sat there looking at the bag for a moment. Then she ate one of the croissants and put the other in the small refrigerator under her desk. She didn't say anything about it to him. He didn't say anything about it to her. But the next morning, there was another bag. It was 5 weeks in when she overheard the name Caruso for the first time. She was working late. She'd been working late almost every night, partly because there was genuinely always more to do, and partly because she'd discovered that the office at 8 in the evening was quieter and calmer, and she could concentrate better. Most of the floor had cleared out. Raphael was in his office with 2 of the peripheral men, and the door was mostly closed. Mostly. Caruso's moving the timeline up, she heard. The voice wasn't Raphael's. One of the other men, lower register, staccato. Then Raphael's voice, level and precise. Because he's afraid. He has reason to be. Everyone has reason to be. A pause. Tell Marco to hold the position on the green-point arrangement until I say otherwise. Caruso's impatient. Impatience makes people careless. She stopped typing. She waited. 2 seconds. 3. Then she started typing again, deliberately, at exactly the rhythm she'd been working at before. A few minutes later, the door opened fully, and the two men left. As they passed her desk, one of them, tall, with a scar along his jaw she'd noticed before, slowed almost imperceptibly and looked at her. It was a look she recognized from the Harbridge days, a measuring look, an assessing look, a look that was calculating how much she'd heard and whether that was going to be a problem. She looked back at her screen. She kept typing. He kept walking. She stayed for another hour. When she was ready to leave, she stood up, gathered her bag, knocked twice on the half-open door to Raphael's office. "Good night," she said. He looked up from his desk. He looked at her for a moment in the particular way he had. Steady, direct, slightly too long for ordinary workplace eye contact. "Go home safely," he said. It was the first time he'd said anything like it to her. She nodded and left. In the elevator, she thought about what she'd heard. She thought about what kind of company had men named Caruso in positions that needed holding and the word arrangement used in a particular way. She thought about the $4 million that had vanished from the Montreal records like it had never existed. She thought about the fact that 14 secretaries had left this job and that she was still here, and that every morning there was a white paper bag on her desk. The elevator opened on the lobby. She walked through it, through the revolving doors, into the cold New York night. Her heels clicked on the pavement. The street was bright and loud after the silence of the upper floor. Taxi horns, someone shouting somewhere, the particular noise of the city going about itself at nighttime. She had 11 days before the third month's rent was due. She had a job that paid more money than she'd ever made. She walked home. She did not look behind her, because looking behind her would require acknowledging that she had noticed something she was fairly certain she was not supposed to have noticed. She did not look behind her, but she walked faster than usual. In the 6th week, 2 things happened in quick succession. The first was that she knocked a $6,000 Murano glass sculpture off a display shelf in the boardroom hallway while trying to catch a sliding stack of files, and it hit the marble floor and separated into approximately 11 pieces, and she stood there in the hallway among the pieces with the files clutched to her chest and her heart attempting to exit her body through her sternum. The man who appeared from around the corner was not one of the office workers. He was one of the peripheral men. He looked at the glass. He looked at her. He said without any inflection at all, "Leave it. I'll take care of it." "It's 6,000. Leave it," he said. And there was something in his voice that made her step back. And she stepped back, and she went to her desk. And when she glanced down the hall 20 minutes later, the glass was gone and the floor was clean, and no one mentioned it. The second thing was that she was called into Raphael's office at 7 in the evening when the floor was almost completely empty, and he told her that there was going to be a meeting on Friday and that he needed her to prepare documentation packages for 7 attendees using a set of financial files he would give her access to, and that the packages needed to be complete, accurate, and in a specific format he showed her, and that they could not be printed on the company system. He looked at her when he said that last part. "I have a personal printer at home," she said. "Use it," he said. "Bring the materials in on Friday morning before 9. He slid a USB drive across the desk. "The files are encrypted. Password is on a separate paper in the envelope." She took the drive. She took the envelope. She looked at the USB drive sitting in her palm for a moment, then at him. "Mr. DeLuca," she said, "I need you to understand something. I'm very good at not asking questions. I've been not asking questions for 6 weeks, and I think I've done it fairly well." She looked up. "But I need to know, am I doing anything that's going to result in me wearing handcuffs someday?" He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "The documentation is financial analysis. Legitimate financial analysis for a meeting between organizations that are structured in ways that don't require regulatory disclosure." He held her gaze. "You're preparing spreadsheets and summary documents. Nothing in those files will expose you to legal liability." "You're sure?" "I don't say things I'm not sure of." She thought about that. She thought about 6 weeks of evidence. The paperwork that disappeared, the meetings without calendars, the men who moved through the building with the particular easy authority of people who carried things under their jackets. She thought about the croissants every morning. She thought about the way he'd said, "Go home safely." She closed her hand around the USB drive. "Friday morning," she said. Before 9, she left his office. She went home. She sat at her kitchen table for 20 minutes before she opened the envelope, read the password, and plugged in the drive. The files were what he said they were. Financial analysis, portfolio summaries, comparative metrics. Everything clean, everything legible, formatted with the meticulous precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She printed the 7 packages. She checked each one 3 times. She put them in 7 labeled folders and packed them in the portfolio. She did not let herself think too hard about what she knew. She set her alarm for 6 and went to sleep. Friday morning, she arrived at 20 minutes to 9. The 43rd floor was already in a different mode. She could feel it before she stepped off the elevator. More people than usual, moving with a purpose that was tight and slightly compressed, like everything was running closer to the surface. 2 of the peripheral men were by the elevator bank. One of them looked at her bag and she understood, somehow without being told, that she should open it. She opened it. He looked at the 7 folders. He looked at her. He nodded once and stepped aside. She walked to her desk. She set down the bag. She began separating the folders for distribution. Raphael's office door was open. He was inside, standing at the window with his back to the room, phone to his ear, speaking quietly. He turned when she came to the door. She held up the folders. 7. He looked at them. Something in his face, a fractional settling, a releasing of something very tightly held, and he nodded. "Give them to Marco," he said, and gestured toward the large man at the far end of the room, whose name she now knew. She handed the folders to Marco. She went back to her desk. She spent the next 4 hours doing ordinary work: expense reconciliation, calendar coordination, drafting 2 routine correspondence pieces, while the boardroom down the hall filled with people she didn't recognize and conversation she could not hear. At 2 in the afternoon, Raphael's office door opened. "Miss Bennett?" She went in. He was sitting at his desk again, jacket on, completely composed. The expression on his face was the particular version of his composure that she was beginning to recognize as him being satisfied with something, though it looked to an outside observer like nothing at all. "The meeting went well," he said. It was not an explanation. It was information, offered, she understood, because she had made the meeting possible. "Good," she said. "You're very good at what you do," he said. He said it the way he said most things, direct, level, devoid of performative warmth, and somehow that made it land differently than a compliment with flourishes would have. "I want to increase your salary." She looked at him. "We agreed on a figure." "I'm changing it." He named a number. It was not a small increase. Molly stood across the desk from him and thought about the 3rd month's rent, and the credit card, and the small cushion of savings she hadn't ever managed to build. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because you earn it." She looked back at him. She thought about 14 other secretaries. She thought about the Murano glass and the Montreal records and the USB drive and the morning croissants. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and that was it. No paperwork produced, no handshake, no ceremony, just his word. And she was beginning to understand, with a certainty that was both steadying and alarming, that in this particular building his word was the only contract that mattered. She went back to her desk. She sat there looking at her screen for a long moment, at the city visible between the tall windows, at the afternoon light falling at its late October angle across the gray carpet. Then her elbow hit her coffee mug. She caught it, barely, water sloshing over her hand, and she thought, not for the first time, that she was somehow still here, that she had not been fired or frightened away or swallowed by whatever this building and this man actually were. She was still here. She set the mug back on her desk and went back to work. It wasn't until she was on the subway home that night, standing in the crowded car with her hand on the overhead rail, that she let herself think about what Raphael DeLuca had said to her on the very first day. "I want to see which one is real." The train lurched. Someone bumped her from behind. She grabbed the rail with both hands. She thought, pragmatism. She still believed that. She was here because the money was real and the money was necessary. And that was the simple, grinding, unsexy truth of it. But she also thought about the way he'd said, "Go home safely." And she thought about how, even now, 6 weeks in, she could not entirely read his face, but she was learning it carefully, detail by detail, the way she learned everything. And she was beginning to think that whatever she found there, underneath all that cold and still and controlled, was going to be something she hadn't planned on. The train rattled through the dark tunnel. She held the rail. And 6 blocks from her stop, her phone buzzed in her bag. A message from a number she now had saved in her contacts simply as RD, because she'd been told on day one that his name was not to appear in any personal correspondence. The Caruso meeting has been moved up. Monday. You'll need to be in the office by 7 a.m. There will be people in that room who do not yet know what I know about them. I may need you there. She stared at the message. She typed back, "Understood. I'll be there." She put her phone back in her bag. She thought, "I may need you there." She thought about the look on the face of the man with the scar along his jaw when he'd measured how much she'd heard. She thought about Caruso's name and what impatience made people do. The train pulled into her stop. She got off. She walked home through the cold, and she thought about Monday, and about what kind of room she was being invited into, and about the particular weight of being needed by a man who, she was increasingly and uncomfortably certain, needed people only when those people were useful in ways that carried genuine risk. She unlocked her door. She went inside. She put her bag down. She did not sleep well. Monday came in cold and gray, the kind of October morning that felt less like weather and more like a warning. Molly was on the 43rd floor by 6:52. She knew this because she checked her phone when she stepped off the elevator, and the time was the first thing she saw. And she stood there for a moment in the empty reception area and breathed in the particular silence of the office before it filled up, before the day's machinery engaged, when it was just her and the recessed lighting and the black-on-black painting at the far end of the hall that she still couldn't look at for too long. She made coffee. Not the espresso. She'd decided in week 2 that the espresso machine was a hazard she wasn't prepared to engage with before 8 a.m., but the regular drip pot in the small kitchen off the main corridor. She made it strong, and she stood there while it brewed, both hands flat on the counter, and she thought about what Raphael had said. There will be people in that room who do not yet know what I know about them. She poured a cup. She went to her desk. She opened her laptop and pulled up the calendar, which showed the Caruso meeting at 9 a.m. in the main boardroom. Listed, she noticed, as a logistics coordination review, which was the kind of deliberately empty description that could mean anything and committed to nothing. She spent the next hour preparing. She didn't know exactly what she was preparing for, so she prepared for everything. Printed summary documents of the company's publicly visible logistics operations, pulled the financial analysis she'd done the previous week for the Eastern Corridor contracts, organized the relevant files by subject and by date, and by what she privately thought of as the order of things that were most likely to be suddenly needed in a meeting that wasn't really about logistics. At 7:45, Raphael arrived. She heard him before she saw him. The elevator, then footsteps on the carpet that were distinctive because they were unhurried in a way that most footsteps in this building weren't, because most people who worked here moved with the ambient tension of people who knew that being slow was a form of risk. But Raphael moved like time deferred to him rather than the reverse. He came around the corner, saw her at her desk, and stopped for one beat. "You're early," he said. "You said 7. "I said by 7. "Same thing." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd gotten better at reading over 6 weeks. This one was the version where he was considering saying something and deciding against it. He walked past her desk toward his office, stopped at the door, and turned back. "The Caruso delegation is arriving at 8:30, he said. "There will be 5 of them. One of them, the man who will introduce himself as Frank Doyle, is not who he says he is." Molly set down her pen. "Who is he?" she said. "His name is Vincent Caruso, the nephew. Not Frank Doyle, who is a logistics consultant from New Jersey with a clean record and a wife who doesn't know he takes money to lend his identity to his employers." He paused. "Vincent doesn't know that I know this. I want it to stay that way until I decide otherwise." "What do you need from me?" "I need you to watch him. I need to know, while I'm managing the room, if his behavior changes at any point. If he makes a phone call, steps out, speaks to anyone outside the group." He looked at her. "Can you do that without being obvious about it?" "You're asking if I can watch someone without them noticing?" "Yes." She thought about 6 years of being the person in the room who everyone's eyes slid past. She thought about how useful that had always been and how much it had cost her, and how the cost was currently something she was putting to work. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." He nodded once. He went into his office and closed the door. She turned back to her desk. She looked at the wall in front of her for a moment, at the clean gray surface and the edge of the city visible through the window at the far end of the corridor. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The Caruso delegation arrived at 8:27. Molly heard them before she saw them. The elevator, then multiple sets of footsteps, then voices that cut off abruptly when they came around the corner and found themselves in the quiet of the 43rd floor. She stood up from her desk to greet them the way she'd greeted every visitor in 6 weeks, professionally, with a controlled smile and a steady voice. There were 5 of them. 4 were exactly what they looked like. Men in their 40s and 50s who wore expensive suits the way certain men wore armor, with a studied casualness that was its own kind of display. They moved into the reception space and looked at things and talked quietly to each other and waited with the contained impatience of men who were used to being the most important people in any given room. The 5th man, the one who introduced himself as Frank Doyle, was different. He was younger, mid-30s, she guessed. Lean and dark-featured with a face that was constructed for pleasantness in the way some faces were. The kind of face that smiled easily and remembered nothing. He shook her hand and said, "Pleased to meet you," and his grip was slightly too firm and slightly too brief, and his eyes, while his mouth was doing the pleasant thing, moved around the room with a speed and thoroughness that she recognized. He was cataloging everything. She showed them to the boardroom. She poured water. She said, "Mr. DeLuca will be with you shortly," and she left. And in the hallway, she took one slow breath and noted 3 things. The man called Frank Doyle had taken a seat at the far end of the table rather than the side his companions had gravitated toward. He'd positioned himself with a clear sight line to the door. And when she'd poured his water, she'd been close enough to notice a slight rectangular outline under his jacket on the left side that was exactly the wrong shape to be a phone. She went back to her desk. She sat. She opened a document she wasn't going to read, and she listened. Raphael went into the boardroom at 9:05. She heard the shift in the room, not audible in any specific way, just a change in the quality of the silence, like a barometric drop before a storm. She heard him say something in greeting, too quiet to make out, and she heard the response from the room, which was slightly louder and slightly more effortful than it needed to be. The way people responded when they were trying to calibrate how much deference was appropriate. For 40 minutes, she sat at her desk and worked and listened, and nothing she heard through the boardroom door was distinct enough to be meaningful. Voices, occasional movement, once, briefly, something that might have been the edge of an argument, then silence, then the resumption of controlled conversation. At 9:51, her desk phone lit up. Internal line, Raphael's extension. She picked up. "Bring in the Eastern Corridor files," he said. "The full set." She'd prepared them. They were already in a folder on the right side of her desk. She picked them up, straightened them once, and walked to the boardroom. She opened the door. 8 people in the room. The 5 from the Caruso delegation, Raphael, and 2 of the peripheral men standing near the far wall with the particular quality of stillness that she'd come to understand was not inaction but readiness. She walked to Raphael and set the folder on the table beside him. She did not look at the man called Frank Doyle. She kept her peripheral vision on him while she directed her eyes at the table, the files, the middle distance. He was watching her. Not in the way the others watched her, with the incurious glance people gave to support staff moving through a room. He was watching her with the assessing attention of someone who'd noticed something and was deciding what it meant. She pulled out a chair slightly, as if checking that the materials were organized correctly for Raphael's access, and set a secondary document on the table near the edge. It was an unnecessary gesture, a thing she manufactured to give herself an extra 4 seconds in the room. She used those 4 seconds. Frank Doyle's left hand was below the table. His right hand was flat on the table surface. He was sitting forward by approximately 2 inches from where he'd been when she left them 40 minutes ago, and the slight forward lean was a particular kind of lean, toward the door, not toward the table. She left the room. She went back to her desk. She sat. She picked up her pen and wrote on the notepad beside her keyboard, FD. Repositioned, left hand down, toward exit. Then she looked at what she'd written and tore it off the pad and held the torn piece in her hand for a moment before walking to Raphael's office, going inside, and putting the paper in the center of his desk blotter. Then she went back to her own desk. 4 minutes later, the boardroom door opened. Not Raphael. Marco. One of the peripheral men, stepping out briefly, looking at her, then going back inside. 2 minutes after that, the quality of the voices changed again. Then Raphael's voice, clear enough to hear even through the closed door, saying something brief and exact. Then silence. They left at 11:15, all five of them, through the lobby, down the elevator. She watched them go from her desk. Frank Doyle, Vincent Caruso, was the last one out of the boardroom and the second to last out of the reception area. And when he passed her desk, he looked at her again with that same assessing look, and she met it directly, neutrally, the way she'd have met the look of any departing guest, and he held it a half-second too long before he followed the others. The elevator closed. She breathed. Raphael came out of the boardroom at 11:22. He walked to her desk and he stood there for a moment, looking at the notepad on her desk, and then at her. "The hand position," he said. "What did you read from it?" "He was reaching for something," she said. "I don't know if he intended to use it. He might have been testing the decision, but the lean toward the door was protective positioning, not aggressive. He wanted an exit more than he wanted a confrontation." "Why?" "Because he didn't know what he was walking into. He came here to read the room, and he couldn't read you." Raphael was quiet for a moment. "He came here to determine whether I knew about him," he said. "Did he get an answer?" "No." Something in his face, not satisfaction exactly, but the functional equivalent of it, cold and precise. "He left without an answer, which means he'll try again with different tools." She thought about the rectangular outline under the jacket. "Are you going to be all right?" He looked at her with an expression that was so genuinely surprised it was almost strange on him, like she'd used a word in the wrong language. "Am I going to be all right?" "I'm asking if you're safe," she said. "I'm asking if whatever is happening between you and this man is going to escalate in a direction that creates—" She stopped. "I'm asking because I work here and I'd like to continue working here, and it helps me to know approximately what level of disruption to anticipate." He looked at her for a long time. "It's going to escalate," he said. "Yes." "All right." "That doesn't concern you?" She looked back at him. "Mr. DeLuca, I've been concerned since about day 4. I've been concerned in a very organized, low-level background way that I've learned to do my work alongside. At this point, it's more or less ambient." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and there was something in it that wasn't quite a question, but wasn't quite a statement either. "You're not going to leave." She picked up her pen. "Not today," she said. He looked at her another moment. Then he went back into his office. 3 days later, she found out about Nadia. It wasn't dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was a piece of administrative correspondence that landed in her inbox as part of a routine batch of internal communications that she processed every Tuesday and Friday. And it happened to reference a personnel matter for the Montreal subsidiary, and the name on the personnel matter was Nadia Voss. She was listed as an executive liaison for the Montreal office, hired 8 months ago. Her file was sparse in the way that certain files in this building were sparse, just enough to be plausible, too thin to be complete. Her salary, however, was not sparse. It was double what the position description warranted by any reasonable benchmark. Molly flagged it. She pulled adjacent records. She cross-referenced Nadia Voss's calendar access with the periods during which the consulting firm Phantom Payments had been moving through the Montreal accounts. Her access overlapped with all of them. She sat with this for 20 minutes, working through it carefully, not jumping to the obvious conclusion, but not avoiding it either. Then she knocked on Raphael's door. "Come." She went in. She put the relevant documents on his desk in the same clean stack she always used. She said, "I think there's a second person involved in the Montreal situation. The original one, Thibault, might not have been working alone." He looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time, and she watched the stillness in his face acquire a new quality. Something tighter, something that compressed inward. "Nadia Voss," he said, "you know the name." He was quiet for a moment. "She was recommended to the Montreal office by someone in my organization who I trust." He set the documents down, precisely aligned. "Trusted." "I'm sorry," Molly said. And she meant it, because she knew what it felt like to discover that your faith in someone had been operating on false information. He looked up at her. The look was unguarded in a way that was almost alarming, a crack in the surface, brief and unmistakable. Then it closed again. Who recommended her? Molly said. A man named Sal Ferretti. He's been with me for 11 years. He said it flatly. He handles internal personnel transitions for 3 of the subsidiary offices. Is it possible he didn't know? It's possible. The pause was precise. It is also possible that what I've been operating with for 11 years is a very patient, very careful arrangement that has taken this long to show its seams. The room was very still. What do you need from me? Molly said. He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, very low, I need to know if there are other names. She looked at him. I'll find them, she said. She went back to her desk. She opened every file she had access to, and she began from the beginning. She found 2 more names in the next 4 days. She did not sleep well during those 4 days. She woke at 3 and 4 in the morning in her apartment, with her mind already moving through columns of numbers and personnel records, working the way her mind worked when it had locked onto something and couldn't disengage. She would lie there in the dark doing arithmetic until she fell back asleep or until the sky outside her window began to gray, and then she would get up and make coffee and go in. The office during those 4 days had a different quality. She couldn't have named it exactly. Everything looked the same, sounded the same, moved the same. But she'd spent enough time in enough offices to read the air in a room the way sailors read weather. And the air in the 43rd floor in those 4 days said, something is happening that most people here do not know about, and the people who do know about it are very carefully not letting it show. She was one of the people who knew. She hadn't meant to become one of those people, but she had crossed a line somewhere, she couldn't name the exact day, that made her irreversibly part of the room and what was happening in it. On the 4th day, she brought Raphael the complete picture. 4 names, Thibault, Voss, and 2 others in different subsidiaries, a man named Poletti in the Chicago office, a woman named Reyes in the Miami distribution center, all hired within a 14-month window, all with access that overlapped precisely. He looked at the documents without speaking for a long time. How long? He said finally. The pattern goes back to the beginning of their employment, she said. But the payments escalated in the last 5 months. I think they were told to accelerate. By who? She looked at him. By whoever hired them to get inside. He put the documents down. Caruso, he said. It wasn't a question. The timing of the acceleration matches the timeline of the Caruso negotiations, she said. I can't prove the connection directly, but the circumstantial alignment is, it's enough. He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she looked at the line of his shoulders and the way he was holding himself and thought, this is what it looks like when someone is calculating something very heavy. Sal Ferretti, he said, to the window. He recommended 2 of these 4 people. Yes, 11 years. She didn't say anything. He turned around. His face was composed, but there was something underneath the composure now that she hadn't seen before. Something that was cold in a different way than his ordinary coldness. Something that had weight to it. You understand, he said, what I'm going to have to do. She looked at him steadily. I understand that you're going to handle this in whatever way you handle things in this organization, she said. And I understand that the way you handle things in this organization is not going to be filed with HR. He held her gaze. Are you all right with that? He said. She thought about Sal Ferretti, 11 years, someone trusted being the vector for something that had just cost this man the ability to trust the last decade of his own judgment. She thought about what she was part of. I'm not going to answer that question, she said, because the honest answer is complicated. But I'm still here and I'm still going to do my job, so you can draw whatever conclusions you want from that. He looked at her for a long moment. I keep waiting, he said quietly, for you to run. I keep almost running, she said, and it was the truest thing she'd said out loud in weeks. And then I don't. He looked at her, and for the first time in 7 weeks, in all the moments she'd spent in this office learning to read the silences and the spaces between his words, she caught something on his face that was not composure and not calculation. It was something much simpler than either of those things and much more dangerous, and it was gone before she could fully name it. Go home, he said. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be difficult. She went home. She did not sleep. The call came at 6:43 in the morning, not from Raphael, from Marco. The number she'd saved because she'd learned in week 3 that when Marco called, it was because Raphael was in a situation where calling himself wasn't an option. "There's a problem at the Greenpoint location," Marco said. His voice was very flat. "Mr. DeLuca needs you to get to the office now, not by 7. Now." "What kind of problem?" "The kind," Marco said, "that you're going to need to see yourself." She was dressed in 11 minutes. She was in a cab in 14. The city at 6:40-something in the morning was a different creature. Sparse and cold, the streets still wet from overnight rain, the light the color of nothing in particular. She sat in the back of the cab and her hands were completely still in her lap, and her heart was doing the desperate, irregular thing it had been doing intermittently for 7 weeks. She got to the building at 7:16. The lobby was wrong. She knew it before she processed the specifics. Just the texture of the space, the particular arrangement of the people in it, the way the 2 men near the elevator were standing. She badged through. She rode up. The 43rd floor was fuller than it had ever been at this hour, and quieter. People she'd never seen were in the space. 4 of them, positioned near the corridor to the boardroom, and they looked at her with the measuring look she'd gotten from the man with the scar on her very first late night. And she walked past them, with her chin level and her pace steady. Marco was at her desk. "Sal Ferretti is in the building," he said without preamble. She put her bag down slowly. "He came in at 6:15, Marco said. "Security let him through because his clearance hadn't been revoked yet." A pause. "Mr. DeLuca didn't know about the clearance." "Where is he now?" "In Mr. DeLuca's office." She looked at the closed door. "With Raphael," she said. "Yes. And you're out here?" "Mr. DeLuca told me to wait out here." She looked at the door. She thought about 11 years and the particular quality of betrayal that came from inside a long-standing trust. She thought about the way Raphael had said 11 years the night before, the weight of it, like a stone dropped into very deep water. She sat at her desk. She kept her eyes on the door. 40 minutes passed. Then the door opened. Sal Ferretti came out first. He was a man in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, the kind of broad-shouldered build that had probably been imposing at 40 and now carried its history in the way he held himself. He looked at her as he passed her desk, and his face was the face of a man who had just gone through something he'd spent years telling himself would never happen, and the thing about that face was that it was not afraid. It was exhausted. He walked to the elevator. He did not look back. Raphael appeared in the doorway of his office. He looked at her. His face was the most controlled she had ever seen it, which meant something had happened in that room that required everything he had to contain. "Get me the personnel records," he said. "All 4 of them. Every document, on my desk in 20 minutes. "Already pulled," she said. "I have them staged." He looked at her. "Of course you do," he said very quietly. And it was not a compliment exactly, but it was something. The way he said it had a texture she hadn't heard in his voice before, something that acknowledged her in a way that made her chest do something uncomfortable. She brought him the files. She went back to her desk. At 9 a.m., Marco came back to her and said, "Mr. DeLuca wants you in the boardroom. There's going to be a meeting at 10, and he wants you inside." "Who's in the meeting?" "Everyone," Marco said, and then, after a pause, "including Caruso." She looked up. "The real one this time," Marco said, "not the nephew." She sat very still for a moment. "All right," she said. She stood. She gathered her notepad and her pen and the files she might need. She walked to the boardroom. She did not think about running. But as she pushed open the boardroom door and felt the air of the room settle around her, heavy and tightly wound, the kind of air that preceded irreversible things, she understood, with a clarity that was cold and absolute, that whatever she was walking into was not the kind of room you walked back out of unchanged. She went in. She sat in the chair Raphael had told Marco to have prepared for her. Not at the far wall, not against the door, but at the table itself, at its corner, close to where Raphael would sit, visible to everyone in the room. She put her notepad on the table. She put her pen down. She thought, "I almost ran." And then the door opened, and Caruso walked in, and the room became something else entirely, and there was no question anymore of almost. Caruso was not what she expected. She had built a picture of him in her mind over the past weeks, assembled from fragments, from the way people said his name in this building, from the particular quality of tension that entered a room whenever his organization was mentioned. She had imagined someone large, perhaps, or visibly menacing, someone whose physical presence matched the weight his name carried. The man who walked through the boardroom door was 63 years old and looked like someone's grandfather. Medium height, soft around the middle, with white hair combed carefully to one side, and a face that had settled into something almost gentle with age. He wore a dark suit that fit well but not expensively. He carried no visible tension in his body. He moved into the room the way men moved into rooms they had already decided they owned. Behind him came 4 men. Not the delegation from last week, different faces, harder ones, with the particular quality of attention that Molly had learned to recognize as professional vigilance. Behind them, and last through the door, came Vincent Caruso, the man who had called himself Frank Doyle. He saw her immediately, and his eyes stopped on her face for one precise moment before moving away. She noted the moment. She wrote nothing down. Raphael was already seated at the head of the table. He did not stand when Caruso entered. He looked at the older man with an expression of complete neutrality, the way you looked at something you had already fully processed. "Domenico," he said. "Raphael." Caruso pulled out the chair directly across from Raphael and sat in it, and the ease with which he did this, without waiting for invitation, without the slight hesitation most people showed when they entered Raphael's territory, told her something about the history between these 2 men. Something long and complicated and not entirely hostile, which was somehow more unsettling than outright enmity would have been. "You've redecorated." "I haven't. The painting is new. It's been there for 3 years. Caruso smiled. It was a real smile, which made it worse. 3 years. I've been away too long." Raphael said nothing. Molly sat at the corner of the table with her notepad and her pen, and she became, as thoroughly as she knew how to become, furniture. She had learned this skill at Harbridge, the art of being present without registering, of occupying space without claiming it, so that the people in the room forgot to perform for you and simply were themselves. She became furniture. She watched. "You know why I'm here," Caruso said. "You're here," Raphael said, "because I invited you." "Which I did, because we've arrived at a point where the alternative to this conversation is one I'd prefer to avoid." "Prefer." Caruso tasted the word like he was checking its temperature. "That's a careful choice." "I choose carefully." "You do." Caruso folded his hands on the table. They were old hands, thick-knuckled, with the kind of stillness that came from decades of choosing when to move and when to wait. "I've always respected that about you, Raphael. You think before you act. It's rarer than it should be in our line of work." "I found your people," Raphael said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of inventory, flat and complete. 4 of them, placed across 3 subsidiary offices over 14 months. I know the access they had. I know what they took and where it went. Caruso did not react. And I want to understand the purpose before I decide what comes next. Caruso looked at him for a moment. Then he looked, briefly, directly, at Molly. "Your secretary found them," he said. "Yes. Interesting." His eyes moved back to Raphael. "I had 4 people inside your organization for 14 months, and the thing that found them was your secretary. She's very good at her job. Evidently." A pause. "How long has she been with you?" 7 weeks. Caruso looked at her again. She met his eyes with the same neutral expression she'd been holding since he walked in. He studied her for a moment with the assessing intelligence of a man who had spent 60 years reading people, and then he said to Raphael, "She shouldn't be in this room." "She stays," Raphael said. The 2 words landed in the room with a finality that closed the subject like a door. Caruso looked at Raphael for a long moment. Something passed between them, some communication conducted entirely in the register of stillness and eye contact, in the language of men who had known each other long enough to argue without words. Then Caruso said, "I want the Montreal operation returned." "There is no Montreal operation," Raphael said. "It's been dismantled. The accounts, gone. The personnel are no longer employed. The consulting entity has been closed." He paused. If you want to revisit the conversation about the Eastern distribution arrangement, I'm willing, but not under these conditions. These conditions. Caruso's voice hadn't changed in pitch or pace, but something in it had shifted. A compression, like pressure building behind a surface. You mean the condition in which I discover that the arrangement I was promised 2 years ago still hasn't been honored? The arrangement we discussed 2 years ago was contingent on your organization holding the Greenpoint corridor. You didn't hold it. I didn't hold it because my man in Brooklyn acted on information that I provided him, Raphael said. Information I provided because your organization had already begun moving into territory that wasn't designated under our agreement, 6 weeks before the Greenpoint situation. Silence. Molly did not move. She was watching Caruso's hands, which had tightened slightly against each other on the table surface. Barely perceptible. The kind of micro-movement that people made when they were recalibrating. You knew, Caruso said. Very quiet. I know most things, Raphael said. Eventually. 6 weeks. Caruso let out a breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something in between, like the release of something held under pressure. You let the whole thing play out, the Greenpoint situation, the Brooklyn response. 14 months of my people inside your offices. I let it develop until I understood the full shape of it, Raphael said. Yes, and the shape of it, Caruso said slowly, is what exactly? In your assessment. The shape of it, Raphael said, is that someone has been advising you incorrectly. Someone has been telling you that I was vulnerable in ways I was not, and positioning you to make moves that served their interests more than yours. The room was completely still. Caruso looked at Raphael. His face had changed. The grandfatherly softness was still there on the surface, but underneath it something had gone very cold and very still, like a pond in winter, everything beneath the ice arrested. Say what you mean, Caruso said. Sal Ferretti, Raphael said. He placed your people in my organization, but before he did that, he spent approximately 8 months providing your organization with intelligence about my operation, specifically selected intelligence, I think you'll find, that consistently overstated my vulnerabilities and understated my reach. He paused. I think you'll also find that Ferretti has been having a separate conversation with a third party about what happens to both of our organizations if we go to war with each other. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences that had preceded it. This one had weight. This one pressed against the walls. Caruso said very quietly, Who? I don't have a name yet. I have the shape of it. Raphael picked up a pen from the table and set it down again, a single precise movement. Which is why I invited you here, rather than responding to your incursions the way I would ordinarily respond. Caruso leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at Raphael. You're telling me that Ferretti played us both. I'm telling you it's a strong possibility. I'm also telling you that I had this conversation with Ferretti this morning and that his response was a pause. Informative, in the way that certain kinds of silence are informative. Molly thought about the man she'd seen walk out of Raphael's office. The exhausted face, not afraid. Exhausted in the way of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally put it down, not by choice, but because the weight had become impossible. She thought about what informative silence meant, coming from Raphael De Luca. Vincent Caruso, Frank Doyle, was watching his grandfather. She could see it from her angle. The younger man's jaw was tight, his hands flat on the table, and he was watching the old man work through something with the focused attention of someone who knew that the calculation being made in the next 30 seconds was going to determine the shape of the next several years. Caruso said to Raphael, What do you want? I want the Greenpoint situation acknowledged as a miscommunication based on bad information from a shared source, Raphael said. I want the Eastern Corridor conversation restarted from a clean position, and I want your organization's resources applied toward identifying the third party, since they have as much to gain from your destabilization as from mine. Caruso was quiet for a long time. Then he said, And your people in my operation? I don't have people in your operation, Raphael said. Caruso looked at him. I had information, Raphael said. I don't need people inside when I have information. Another long silence. Then, slowly, something in Caruso's posture shifted. Not relaxing, exactly, but resettling. the particular physical adjustment of a man who has made a decision. "We'll need a week," Caruso said, "to review what Ferretti gave us." "Take 2, Raphael said, "and send me whatever you find." Caruso nodded once. He stood. He buttoned his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man who intended to walk out of this room exactly the way he'd walked in. He looked at Molly one more time before he left. "You," he said, in the tone of someone making a note they'll want to reference later. Then he walked out. Vincent, not Frank, she kept having to correct herself, was the last to leave. He stopped at the door, and he looked at Raphael, and then he looked at Molly, and what was on his face was not the assessing calculation of their first meeting. It was something closer to genuine unease, the expression of a man who had come to this building expecting to be the one doing the reading, and had discovered that he'd been read before he walked in. He left. The door closed. The room exhaled. She was at her desk for 12 minutes before the screaming started. It came from the corridor, not from the floor's main spaces, but from somewhere deeper, the back hallway near the secondary conference rooms. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand, the way the body responded to certain sounds before the mind caught up. Marco was already moving. 2 of the other men were moving. She followed, because the sound was wrong in a way that made standing still impossible. The back corridor. The door to the secondary conference room, opened 6 inches. Through the gap she could see enough. A man she didn't recognize, standing over a phone, saying something with his back to the door, and then she processed the rest of what she was seeing, and her stomach dropped clean through the floor. The man was on the phone. He was speaking quietly now. The screaming had stopped, replaced by something controlled and low and rapid. He was one of the men who had come with Caruso. One of the 4 background figures who had stood silently along the wall throughout the entire meeting. He hadn't left with the others. Marco pushed the door open. The man spun around. He looked at Marco and he looked at Molly, and his face went through 3 things very fast. Surprise, calculation, and then something else. Something that was not quite resignation. He ended the call. Marco said, "Put the phone on the table." The man put the phone on the table. Marco picked it up and looked at the screen. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Molly. Not at the man, at Molly. And his expression was the flattest she had ever seen on a human face. "Get Mr. DeLuca," Marco said. She went. She covered the distance from the back corridor to Raphael's office, in the particular way she moved when she needed to move fast without running. The quick walk, heels silent on the thick carpet, body controlled. And she knocked twice on his door and opened it. He was at his desk, jacket off, writing something. "There's a man in the back conference room," she said. "He stayed behind. He was on a call. Marco has his phone." Raphael was on his feet before she finished the sentence. She followed him back. The man was still standing at the table. He was in his early 40s, with a compact build and dark eyes that were doing the calculation behind a face that had gone deliberately neutral. Raphael walked into the room and stood across the table from him and looked at him the way he looked at things he'd already decided to fully understand. "Who were you calling?" Raphael said. The man said nothing. "You came in with Caruso," Raphael said. "You sat in my boardroom for an hour and 40 minutes, and you listened to a conversation that Domenico Caruso and I agreed to conduct privately. And then, while the rest of his delegation went downstairs, you stayed in my building and made a phone call." He paused. "To who?" "Nothing." Marco set the phone on the table and turned the screen toward Raphael. Raphael looked at it. He looked at it for several seconds. His face did not change. He looked up at the man. "Tell me about Thomas Ricci," he said. Molly did not know that name, but the effect of it on the man across the table was instant and visceral. A fractional flinch, quickly controlled, that confirmed the name in the way that certain denials confirmed things. "I don't know that name," the man said. First words he'd spoken. His voice was steady in the way that voices were steady when the person was working hard at it. "The number you called is registered to a logistics company in Newark," Raphael said. "The logistics company in Newark was incorporated 4 months ago. Its sole director is a man named Carl Weiss, who has an address in Hoboken that he's held for 7 years, except that for the last 3 of those 7 years, the utilities on that address have been billed to an account owned by a trust registered in Delaware, and that trust..." He paused. That trust was set up by a lawyer in Philadelphia whose other clients include, among others, Thomas Ricci. Molly stood at the door. She was very still. She was listening to Raphael dismantle the man across the table with a precision that made her think of surgery, not violent, not heated, just incisive, each fact placed deliberately in the sequence that would produce the maximum revelation. He'd known about Thomas Ricci. He'd known about it before this meeting, before this man had made his call. He'd let the meeting happen knowing there was a wire inside his own boardroom. The man said very quietly, "What do you want?" "I want to know," Raphael said, "whether Domenico Caruso knows about his association with Ricci." A silence. "He doesn't," the man said. And then, after another pause, with the specific exhaustion of someone abandoning a position they'd held too long, "Ricci placed me with him 4 years ago. Caruso thinks I came up through the Philly network." "You're Ricci's," Raphael said. "Yes. And the purpose?" "The purpose?" The man stopped, started again. "The purpose was to keep Caruso and DeLuca from ever resolving anything, to keep the pressure between your two organizations at a level where neither of you could consolidate, where you'd both be—" He stopped. "Occupied," Raphael said. "Yes. While Ricci positioned himself in the space between us." The man said nothing. He didn't need to. Raphael stepped back from the table. He looked at Marco. Something passed between them that Molly could not read, conducted in the register of men who had worked alongside each other long enough to communicate in the compression of a glance. Marco said to the man, "Sit down." The man sat. Raphael walked out of the room. Molly stepped aside to let him pass, and he moved down the corridor toward his office, and she followed him because she didn't know what else to do, because she had learned over 7 weeks that when Raphael moved with that particular quality of purpose, you stayed close or you lost the thread. He went into his office. He didn't sit. He stood at the window again. The window he'd stood at when she'd brought him the Ferretti documents. The window that looked out over lower Manhattan in its enormous indifferent sprawl. She stood at the door. "Thomas Ricci," she said. "He runs the Northeastern port operations. Technically legitimate, shipping, import logistics, cargo insurance." He kept his eyes on the city. "He's been building for 6 years. Patient. Very patient." A pause. "He needed Caruso and me in conflict to keep us from noticing the ground shifting under both of us. He had people inside Caruso's organization," Molly said. "And Ferretti? Ferretti wasn't serving a third party in general. He was specifically serving Ricci." Yes. She thought about the shape of it. The 14 months of planted people. The manufactured intelligence that had pushed Caruso toward moves that looked aggressive and pushed Raphael toward defensive countermoves. 2 organizations circling each other while a third party consolidated around them. "He would have let you go to war," she said. "He was counting on it. And then moved into the vacuum." He turned from the window. He looked at her. His face was completely controlled, but his eyes had the quality she'd seen once before. The crack in the surface, brief and deep. "I had most of this. I was missing the chain between Ferretti and Ricci. The man in the back room gave me the chain." She processed this. "You knew someone in Caruso's delegation was going to stay behind," she said slowly. "I suspected. You staged the meeting to draw it out. I presented information that would be valuable enough to report immediately." "Yes." She looked at him. "You used the meeting as bait." "Yes." She thought about sitting at that table, at the corner, visible to everyone. She thought about Caruso looking at her and Raphael saying she stays. She thought about the fact that she had been in the room and had been seen, and that the man in the back corridor had seen her before she'd seen him. "Did you know," she said, and her voice came out very flat, "that there was someone in that room who was reporting everything that happened in it?" Raphael held her gaze. "I suspected there would be," he said. "Yes." The silence between them had a new quality. She could feel the shape of something in it, something she needed to name correctly, or she was going to respond to it in the wrong way. "You brought me into a room," she said carefully, "that you knew was potentially being monitored by a man who works for someone you've been describing as an existential threat to your organization." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me that." "No." She looked at him. He looked back. His face was still, but not in the ordinary way. In the way of someone who is waiting, who knows that the next thing said in this room matters. "Why?" she said. "Because you would have been different in the room if you'd known," he said, "and I needed you to be exactly as you were." She thought about furniture. She thought about the skills she'd learned and how she'd deployed it, and how it had never occurred to her to ask whether someone was watching her deploy it. "You needed me to be unaware," she said. "I needed you to be authentic," he said. "There's a difference." She turned that over. She was very good at turning things over quickly, at finding the precise edge of an argument, and she found it here and held it in her mind for a moment. Then she said, "That's a meaningful distinction, and I'm going to decide later whether it's meaningful enough." Something crossed his face, the almost expression, the ripple. "Fair," he said. She let out a breath. "What happens now?" "Now I call Caruso," he said. "I tell him about the man and his delegation. I tell him about Ricci. And then Caruso and I have a very different conversation than the one we just had. And Ricci." He looked at her. "Ricci becomes a shared problem. Is that going to be dangerous?" He was quiet for a moment. "More dangerous than anything that's happened so far." She stood there at the door of his office, with the city behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she thought about 7 weeks. She thought about the things she'd found and the things she'd been placed in front of without being fully told. And she thought about the pay increase and the croissants and go home safely, and she stays. She thought about the fact that she was in this now, genuinely in it, not as a peripheral figure who could plausibly claim ignorance, but as someone whose face had been in that room and whose name, she realized with a cold and sudden clarity, had probably been on a phone call to Thomas Ricci's man in Newark before Marco had even reached the door. They knew who she was. That understanding settled into her body the way cold water settled, starting at the surface and working downward until it reached bone. "I need to know something," she said, "and I need a direct answer." He looked at her. "Am I safe?" she said. "In the general sense. Am I a person who walks around in this city and is reasonably safe?" He held her gaze for a long time, long enough that she could feel the quality of the calculation behind it. Not evasion, but precision, the careful selection of exactly how much truth was appropriate. "You were safe this morning," he said. "As of approximately 40 minutes ago, the answer to that question has become more complicated." She nodded. She nodded in the careful, deliberate way of someone receiving information they had, in some part already prepared themselves to receive. "All right," she said. "Molly?" "I said all right." She took a breath, steady. "Make your call to Caruso. I'll be at my desk." She turned to leave. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said. She stopped. She didn't turn around. She stood in the doorway with her back to him, and she thought about what that sentence meant coming from this specific man in this specific building, and she thought about all the things she'd learned in 7 weeks about what his word was worth and what the weight of it felt like. She thought about how badly she wanted to believe it. She thought about how believing it was probably the most dangerous thing she'd done since she walked into this office and spilled coffee on his suit. "I know," she said, and she walked back to her desk. She sat down. She opened her laptop. She stared at the screen. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at the screen for a long moment before she answered. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, with the particular composure of someone who was accustomed to being the one making calls of this nature. "Ms. Bennett," it said, "my name isn't important yet, but I think you and I should have a conversation before Mr. DeLuca has the chance to have his." A pause. "I know what you found in the subsidiary records. I know what you brought to him. And I want you to understand something very clearly before this goes any further." Another pause, precise and deliberate. "You're not an employee anymore. You are a piece on a board, and right now you are the most exposed piece on that board." The line was silent. She looked up from her phone and across the office, toward Raphael's closed door, toward the city beyond the... She did not hang up. That was the first decision, and she made it in the space of 2 seconds. And it was the kind of decision that felt small in the moment and was not small at all. "I'm listening," she said. The voice on the other end took a breath. Not nervousness, she thought, but the breath of a man who was settling into something he'd prepared for. "Good. That's the right instinct. Listening is what's kept you alive this far. You said I was exposed? You are. You found the subsidiaries. You sat in the boardroom this morning. You've been in that building for 7 weeks learning things that DeLuca's own soldiers don't know, and now Ricci's people know your name. A pause. Do you understand what that means? Tell me what you want, she said. Her voice was steady. She was watching Raphael's closed office door while she spoke. I want you to walk out of that building in the next 10 minutes, the voice said. I want you to go home, pack a bag, and wait for a car. You'll be relocated. You'll be compensated. And in approximately 6 weeks, when this is resolved, you'll be free to go wherever you want. You want me to run. I want you to survive. She was quiet for a moment. Who are you? Someone who's been watching DeLuca for a long time. Someone who understands that the people around him have a poor statistical record of coming out of his problems intact. She thought about 14 secretaries. She thought about Sal Ferretti's exhausted face. She thought about the way Raphael had said, I won't let anything happen to you, and the way she'd turned it over in her mind and the specific weight of it. No, she said. A pause. Ms. Bennett, no. She said it again, cleaner. Whatever you're offering, no. And I'm going to tell Mr. DeLuca about this call in approximately 30 seconds, so if you have something specific you want him to know, you should say it now. The line went quiet. Then the voice said, very low, he can't protect you from what's already been set in motion. The call ended. She lowered the phone from her ear. She sat for 1 breath, 2, 3. Then she stood up, walked to Raphael's office, and knocked twice. Come. She opened the door. He was at his desk with his phone to his ear, mid-call, and he looked at her and read her face in approximately 1 second and said into the phone, I'll call you back, and set it down. Someone just called me, she said. Unknown number. They knew my name. They knew about the subsidiary work. They knew about the boardroom this morning. She set her phone on his desk. The number's in the recent calls. It'll probably be a dead end, but Marco should look at it. He was already reaching for it. What did they say? They wanted me to leave the building and get in a car. She met his eyes. They said Ricci's people know who I am. He was very still. They said you can't protect me from what's already in motion, she said. I told them no. I'm telling you because you need to know, not because I need you to. I don't need anything right now. I just need you to know. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up from his desk and he moved to the door of his office and opened it and said very quietly to the room, Marco. Marco appeared from the corridor within 4 seconds. Full protocol, Raphael said. Now. And get me Caruso. Marco moved. She could hear the shift in the floor immediately. Footsteps, doors, the low rapid exchange of instructions. The office reorganizing itself around a new level of threat, the way a body reorganized itself around physical shock. Raphael looked at her. You're not going home tonight. I figured. There's a room in the building, 14th floor. It's secure. All right. Molly. He said her name in the way he'd said it a handful of times, not as a professional address, but as a specific naming, the way you said someone's name when you needed them to actually hear what came next. I need you to understand the situation we're in right now. Tell me, Ricci knows we have his man. He knows Caruso was in this building today. He knows the arrangement he built between our two organizations has just been exposed. He paused. He has 2 options. He withdraws and rebuilds over years, or he acts immediately while there's still pressure and confusion. He'll act, she said. Yes. How? The weakest point, he said, and he looked at her and she understood what he meant before he said it, and she felt the cold move through her again, deeper this time, reaching places the first wave hadn't reached. You need to stay in this building. I understand. I'm not certain I can guarantee. Raphael. She said his name for the first time. No title, no professional distance, just his name, which came out steadier than she felt. I know, just tell me what you need me to do. Becky. What he needed her to do for the next 4 hours was work. It was the strangest 4 hours of her life. The floor was operating at a level of contained intensity she hadn't seen before. Men moving with purpose, calls being made and received, the boardroom occupied continuously with shifting configurations of people she didn't recognize. And in the middle of all of it, she sat at her desk and did what Raphael had asked. She pulled every financial document related to Ricci's port operations that existed anywhere in the DeLuca system. Invoices, shipping manifests, insurance records, anything that had touched their operations in the past 3 years. And she built a map. It was what she was good at, finding the pattern in the noise, seeing the shape in the numbers. She built the map, and she did not think about the phone call or the car that was presumably still waiting somewhere outside, or the specific texture of the fear that had settled into her body like a second skeleton. She worked, because working was the thing she could control, and control was the only currency that felt real right now. At 2:40 in the afternoon, she found it. Not a discrepancy this time. Not a phantom payment or a misaligned account code. Something larger and more structural. A pattern in Ricci's shipping insurance claims over 18 months that, cross-referenced against Port Authority arrival records she'd pulled from a public database, revealed a systematic gap. Cargo that was insured but never logged. Claims paid on shipments that, according to port records, didn't exist. Not money laundering. Something going into the ports, not out. She printed it. She stood up. She walked to Raphael's office and she knocked. And she went in without waiting, which she had never done before. And he was on the phone, and he looked at her, and she put the documents in front of him and pointed at the summary line she'd written at the top and watched his eyes move across it. He ended the call without saying goodbye. He read the documents. All of them, fast, with the total attention he gave to everything. Ghost cargo, he said. The insurance claims are real and paid. The shipments aren't in any port arrival record, which means either the records are falsified or the cargo is coming in through channels that aren't being officially logged. What's coming in? I don't know. But the volume and the frequency, and the fact that he's been doing it for at least 18 months and expanding the pattern every quarter. She stopped. It's not product. The cargo weights are inconsistent with anything standardized. It's variable. It's different every time. He was looking at the documents. This is what he's protecting, Raphael said. Very quiet. This is why he needed Caruso and me occupied. Not the territory. Not the distribution networks. He set the documents down. This. She looked at him. What do we do with it? We use it. He looked up. This is leverage, Molly. Real leverage. This is the thing that Ricci cannot afford to have. The window exploded. Not the whole window. A section of it. The upper left pane of the floor-to-ceiling glass on the west wall, which fractured inward in a burst of cold air and glass particles, and the simultaneous deafening crack of something hitting it from outside with tremendous force. She was on the floor before she understood she'd moved. Pure instinct, body dropping, hands overhead, the carpet rough against her palms. The office was full of the sound of settling glass and wind from outside, 43 floors up. October air flooding in cold and immediate. Raphael was beside her, not over her, not pulling her, beside her, which she registered through the shock as significant as the action of a man whose first instinct was to be at the same level rather than above it. Are you hit? He said. No, are you? No. He was already moving, low toward the door. Stay down. Where are you? Stay down. She stayed down. She pressed herself against the side of the desk, below the line of the window, and she breathed through her mouth the way she'd read somewhere you were supposed to breathe in high-stress situations, slow and deliberate. And she listened. The floor outside the office was in controlled chaos. Fast movement, voices low and clipped. She heard Marco. She heard two other voices she recognized from the peripheral men. She heard, from somewhere below and outside, the sound of something she identified after a moment as vehicles moving fast on the street. She did not hear gunshots. She didn't know whether that was good or not. The office door opened. One of the peripheral men, not Marco, the one with the scar on his jaw, whose name she'd eventually learned was Dario, came in and scanned the room and looked at her behind the desk. Ms. Bennett, come with me. Where's... Now, please. She got up. Her knees were not entirely steady. She held the edge of the desk for 1 second, got her balance, and followed Dario into the corridor. The corridor was transformed. 3 men at each end. 2 more at the elevator bank. Every piece of ambient normalcy stripped away, replaced by the stark operational reality of what this floor actually was when the performance of a logistics company was suspended. Dario moved fast, and she matched his pace, and he took her not to the stairs, but to a door she'd never used, a service access she'd barely registered as existing, and through it to a secondary stairwell, narrow, lit by emergency lighting, concrete underfoot instead of carpet. 14th floor, he said. Keep moving. What happened to the window? We're looking into it. That's not an answer. No, he said, starting down the stairs. It isn't. She followed him. 29 flights. Her heels on concrete were loud, and she took them off on the third landing and carried them and went in her stockings, and it was faster. Dario noticed but said nothing. They reached the 14th floor. A different world, storage primarily, and what appeared to be server infrastructure behind locked cages. And at the far end a door that required a key card Dario produced from his jacket. Beyond it was a space that looked like it had been assembled for exactly this purpose. A room with no exterior windows, a cot along one wall, a table, chairs, a laptop already open on the table, a landline phone. Stay here, Dario said. For how long? Until Mr. DeLuca says otherwise. Is he all right? Dario looked at her. In the flat emergency lighting, his face was stripped of its professional blankness, and she could see something under it, not fear, but its functional equivalent, the physiological state of a man whose threat assessment had just been recalibrated. He's managing the situation, Dario said. He left. The door locked behind him. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then she sat at the table and opened the laptop and found it connected to the company's internal network. And she went back to work because it was the only thing she could do, and she needed to do something, or the fear was going to win. An hour and 20 minutes later, the door opened. Raphael came in alone. He was still in the same clothes. She looked immediately for blood and found none, which released something in her chest that had been clenched since the window. His jacket was gone. His face had the particular quality of compression she'd seen after the Ferretti meeting, after the boardroom, after every moment in the past weeks when something had required him to absorb something large and keep moving. He sat in the chair across from her. It wasn't a shot, he said. Drone, remote-controlled, commercial-grade, and modified to carry weight. It hit the upper pane at approximately 200 feet above street level. He paused. A message. Not an attempt. Ricci. Yes. She looked at him. He's telling you he can reach the 43rd floor. He's telling me he knows where we were standing. His eyes held hers. He has eyes on the building. Has had them for some time. She thought about that. The call this morning, she said. The one to my cell. They knew I was in the building. They knew which meetings I'd been in. Yes. He has someone inside. Had, Raphael said. We've identified them. They've been removed. She thought about what removed meant in this building and didn't pursue it. What happens now? She said. Now we move. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. I've spoken with Caruso. He's in. He was less surprised about Ricci than I expected, which tells me he's had his own suspicions that he wasn't ready to act on alone. A pause. Together, we have the reach to close this. But we have to move tonight before Ricci recalibrates and pulls back. Where? Ricci uses a warehouse complex in Greenpoint for his port operations clearinghouse. It's where the ghost cargo documentation is processed before it moves. If we can get there with what you built. He glanced at the documents she'd brought downstairs, which she'd thought to grab from Raphael's desk on the way out, and which were now in a folder beside the laptop. We have enough to dismantle the entire operation, and to hand what we find there to people who will ensure Ricci becomes someone else's problem. Federal, she said. He held her gaze. Yes. She thought about this company and its sensitive operations and things she'd been told not to ask questions about, and she thought about the fact that Raphael DeLuca was sitting across from her describing a plan to involve federal authorities, which was a significant departure from everything she understood about how things were handled in this building. That's not your usual approach, she said. No. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because Ricci's ghost cargo operation is not the kind of problem my organization should be the one to close, he said. What's coming into those ports? He stopped. Something moved through his face, brief and dark. I don't move that kind of thing. I don't operate in that space. And the people who do are not going to respond to the same pressures that work in our world. She looked at him. What's in the cargo? He held her gaze. People, he said. The word landed in the room and stayed there. She sat with it for a moment, breathing steadily, feeling the specific weight of it as it settled through her. Through the fear and the adrenaline and the 7 weeks and the window and everything else, and found its true dimension. All right, she said. Her voice was very quiet. What do you need from me? The map you built. The cross-reference between the insurance claims and the port records. I need it in a format that is unambiguous, that a person with no financial background can follow, and that can be transferred to a drive and handed to someone tonight. He looked at her. Can you do that in 2 hours? 1.5, she said, and reached for the laptop. He put his hand over hers, not holding it, just placing it there. 1 moment, a contact that lasted 3 seconds and no more. She looked down at his hand on hers and then up at his face. I'm sorry, he said. About the room, about the call, about the window. He said it flat and direct, the way he said everything. No performance, no cushioning. You were not supposed to be in the position you're currently in. She looked at him. I know. If you want to walk out of here tonight, before this moves further, Raphael. She turned her hand over briefly under his, a contact that lasted exactly as long as his had. Stop. He looked at her. She pulled her hand back and turned to the laptop. 1.5 hours, she said. Let me work. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood. He went to the door. He stopped. When this is over, he said, to the door, not quite turning back, I'm going to need you to make a decision about what you do next, about whether you stay. She kept her eyes on the screen. Ask me when it's over. He left. She worked. Well, the next 90 minutes were the most focused she had ever been in her life. Everything else, the fear, the drone, the word, people landing in the room like a stone, went somewhere else. Into a compartment she sealed and set aside, and she built the document with everything she had. She built it clean and linear and irrefutable. She took the ghost cargo pattern and laid it out step by step, from the first insurance claim to the most recent port discrepancy. With every supporting record cited and dated, the gaps in the official documentation mapped against the insurance payout record. The volume analysis that showed the cargo weights were consistent with human transport at the higher end of the range. She added the financial trails she'd originally mapped, the subsidiaries, the phantom consulting firms, the Ferretti connection, and showed how the cash flows had been used to fund the port operations, creating a closed loop between the organizational infiltration and the underlying criminal enterprise. She finished it in 83 minutes. She formatted it, checked it 3 times, saved it to the company drive, and then flagged Marco on the internal system. He came in 4 minutes later with a drive. She transferred the files. She handed him the drive. She said, make sure whoever receives this starts on page 4. The first 3 pages are context. Page 4 is where the unambiguous part begins. Marco took the drive. He looked at her for a moment with the expression he almost never showed, not the professional blankness, but something underneath it, something that was as close to respect as she'd ever seen on his face. Then he left. She sat back. She looked at the ceiling of the windowless room on the 14th floor. She thought about $140,000 base and the back rent and the 3 months she'd been carrying and the small cushion of savings she'd never managed to build. She thought about a paper bag with 2 croissants and the words, "Go home safely," and she stays. She thought about people in cargo containers moving through ports that had no record of their arrival. At 9:17 p.m., the door opened and Dario came in and said, "We're moving in 30 minutes. Mr. DeLuca wants you in the vehicle." She looked up. Why? Because Ricci's people will be monitoring the building and a vehicle leaving without you doesn't match the intelligence picture he has. He paused. And because Mr. DeLuca said so. She stood. She looked down at herself. 8 hours into the day's clothes, 1 shoe in each hand where she'd been holding them since the 14th floor door, stockings with a run along the left calf that she'd only just noticed. She put the shoes back on. All right, she said. The convoy assembled in the building's underground parking level. 3 vehicles, black, the kind of anonymous heavy SUVs that could be anything in New York City at 10 p.m. and therefore were nothing. She was put in the second vehicle. Raphael was already inside in the far seat, jacket back on, and in the dark of the garage she could see that he had something under his jacket that she had never seen on him before and did not look at directly. 2 of the peripheral men got in. Dario in the front passenger, the driver she didn't know. The vehicle moved. For 6 minutes they drove in silence through the nighttime streets. The route indirect, she noticed, taking turns that didn't make geographic sense until she understood that the route itself was the point. The unpredictability of it, the impossibility of tracking. Then Marco's voice came through a radio in the front seat. "We have a problem at Greenpoint." Raphael picked up the radio. "Say it." Ricci moved the timeline. "The warehouse is active. There are people already inside." A pause, and she heard in the pause the thing that Marco was controlling. "Not Ricci's people, Raphael. The cargo. It arrived early." The vehicle kept moving. Raphael was very still. "How many?" he said. "Unknown. Ricci knows we're coming. He moved the cargo in as a shield." Marco's voice was flat and hard. "He thinks you won't move on the building while—" "He's wrong," Raphael said. The radio was quiet for a moment. "I know," Marco said. "That's why I'm telling you now." Raphael set the radio down. He looked out the window at the city going past. The transition from Manhattan to the bridge, the water below, the industrial dark of Greenpoint ahead. She looked at his face in profile. She watched him hold something enormous inside the stillness of his expression, the weight of a decision that could not be undone once it was made, that would define every version of this story going forward regardless of how it ended. He turned and looked at her. She looked back. She said, "You already know what you're going to do." "Yes." "Then do it." He picked up the radio. "Marco," he said. "Call the number." A pause. "You're sure?" "Call it." She understood what the number was. She understood what calling it meant for every calculation she'd made about this man and this building and the line between the things he was and the things he wasn't. She understood that whatever she had thought Raphael DeLuca was, whatever category she'd been quietly building for him in the 7 weeks she'd spent learning the texture of his silences, the call he'd just authorized to a federal contact she hadn't known he had, was something that didn't fit neatly into any of those categories. The vehicle crossed the bridge. Greenpoint came up ahead. Water, warehouses, the specific dark of industrial waterfront at night. She could see lights where lights shouldn't be, at the far end of the complex. Dario turned around from the front seat. He had a vest in his hands. He looked at her. "Put this on," he said. She took it. Her hands were steady. She put it on and Dario leaned back and tightened the side fasteners, and she sat there in the dark-moving vehicle wearing body armor over the clothes she'd worn to a board meeting that morning, and she thought, 7 weeks ago I was 4 minutes late to a job interview and spilled coffee on a stranger's suit. The vehicle stopped. Raphael's door opened. He stepped out and she followed without being asked, because at this point the choice of whether to follow or not had become academic. She was in this, had been in this for some time, and standing still was no longer a position that existed. The warehouse was ahead of them across an open lot. Corrugated steel, large, lit from within, 2 vehicles outside she didn't recognize. Raphael's men were fanning out around the perimeter with the economical coordination of people who had done this before. She felt Raphael's hand at her arm, not gripping, steering. "Stay behind Marco," he said. "Not behind me. Marco." "Okay." "If something—" "Raphael." He stopped. She looked at him in the half-dark of the waterfront and she said very quietly, "Come back." He looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on his face in that moment was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, the most fully human. Something between fear and something much warmer than fear. Something she did not have a clean word for but recognized in her chest with a completeness that terrified her more than the warehouse or the drone or the phone call had. Then it was gone, replaced by the stillness. He turned toward the warehouse. The door came open from the inside, and the night split apart with light and sound, and Raphael's men moved and she moved with Marco, because that was what she'd been told to do, and the warehouse swallowed them. The warehouse swallowed them whole. She stayed behind Marco the way Raphael had told her to. Close, matching his pace, watching the geometry of the space as it opened up around them. The interior was enormous. 40 feet of ceiling, maybe more, lost in the shadows above industrial lighting that hung in suspended rows and cast everything in a hard yellow that flattened depth and made distances harder to judge. Steel shelving units along the eastern wall, stacked with crates and wrapped pallets. A central floor space large enough to move vehicles through. The smell of the place was salt and diesel, and something underneath both of those things that she identified and then stopped identifying because naming it fully would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend right now. There were people on the floor, not Ricci's people, or not only Ricci's people. Along the western wall, in a space that had been partially partitioned with temporary barriers, there were figures sitting and lying on the concrete. Maybe 30 of them, maybe more. In the poor light, she couldn't be certain. They were still. They were watching the men who had just come through the door with the particular watchfulness of people who had learned that stillness was the safest response to any sudden change. She looked at them and she looked away because she had a job to do, and looking was going to cost her the steadiness she needed. The men, Ricci's, 3 of them visible near the center of the floor, had not been expecting the speed of entry. Raphael's people had come through 2 doors simultaneously, and the compression of the space and the number of armed men who had appeared in the span of 4 seconds had produced the particular stillness of a situation that had tipped past the point where resistance was a rational calculation. One of them ran the numbers faster than the others and went for the side door, and Dario was already there, and the man stopped. Raphael was at the center of the floor. He was looking at a man she hadn't seen before. 50s, heavy through the shoulders, with the florid complexion of someone whose blood pressure had been a problem for years. The man was standing near a folding table that held a laptop, a phone, and what appeared to be a set of shipping documents. He was looking at Raphael with an expression that was trying very hard to be contempt, and achieving something closer to the physiological state that preceded it. Thomas Ricci. She knew it before anyone said it. The way he stood, the way the space organized itself around him, not with deference, the way spaces organize themselves around Raphael, but with the brittle authority of a man who had purchased his position and knew on some level that purchased things could be repurchased. "You brought the cavalry," Ricci said. His voice was rough and slightly too loud for the space. "Performance." "I'm impressed. A little. I expected you to try to handle this quietly." "I handle things the way the situation warrants," Raphael said. "Federals outside." Ricci glanced toward the door. "That's a significant departure for you." "You made it necessary." Ricci's eyes moved to the western wall, to the people sitting there, then back to Raphael. And in that movement was every calculation the man had made about his own leverage and how long it would hold. "You're not going to move in here," Ricci said. "Not with—" "I already moved in," Raphael said. "The federal team is securing the perimeter. They're not coming in yet because I asked them to wait 3 minutes." He looked at Ricci with the flat, complete attention she knew so well. "You have those 3 minutes to make a decision about how this ends for you. After that, the decision is no longer yours." Ricci looked at him. The contempt that had been performing as contempt was starting to show its actual substrate, a clenching around the eyes, a stillness of the jaw that was held rather than natural. "You have nothing on me," Ricci said. "This facility is a legitimate—" "I have 18 months of ghost cargo documentation," Raphael said. "Insurance claims cross-referenced against Port Authority records, with a full financial trail connecting the clearinghouse accounts to your operating entity in Newark. I have the testimony of a man who spent 4 years inside Caruso's organization on your behalf." He paused. "And I have a federal agent who has been building a parallel case for 11 months and has been waiting for the documentation that was delivered to him 45 minutes ago." Ricci said nothing. "The 3 minutes," Raphael said, "are for you to decide whether the people on that wall are cargo to you or a liability. Because if they're cargo, you'll use them as leverage for as long as you can, and the end of this night will be worse for you than if they're a liability you're willing to release." Ricci's jaw was working. She could see it from where she stood, the physical manifestation of a man whose plan had been built on a foundation that had just been removed, who was doing the rapid and unpleasant arithmetic of what remained. He looked at the people against the wall. He looked at them the way a man looked at something he'd stopped thinking of as human and was now being required to look at again. "Let them go," he said, to the man nearest the partition. The man looked at Ricci, looked at Raphael, made his own calculation and moved to the partition. Molly watched the people on the western wall begin to move, slowly at first, then faster. The specific controlled urgency of people who had been very still for a very long time and were not entirely certain that movement was safe but were choosing it anyway. Marco was already directing them toward the door she'd come in through, where she could see two of Raphael's men guiding them out into the night air. She was watching this when Ricci moved, not toward the door, not toward Raphael. He moved toward the table, toward the laptop, with the specific speed of a man executing something he'd prepared, a contingency, a delete, a final erasure of something he couldn't afford to leave behind. She moved faster. She didn't think about it. Her body made the decision, and she was crossing the floor in 6 fast steps, and her hand came down on the laptop lid before Ricci's hand reached the keyboard, and she pulled it off the table and stepped back and held it against her chest and looked at Ricci from a distance of approximately 4 feet. He looked at her. She looked back. For 1 second, a second that she would remember in precise physical detail for a very long time afterward. She was the only thing between Thomas Ricci and the last piece of the evidence chain, and she knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them moved. Then Raphael was there, between her and Ricci, with the completeness of a wall, and the moment collapsed, and 2 of Raphael's men took Ricci's arms, and it was done. She stood there with the laptop against her chest, breathing, feeling her heartbeat in places she didn't normally feel it. Raphael turned to look at her. She held out the laptop. He took it. He looked at her face, then at the laptop, then at her face again. "You ran toward him," he said. "I ran toward the table," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for another moment. "Molly." "I'm fine," she said. "I'm okay." She took a breath. "Steady. Get him outside. The federal team is waiting." He held her gaze for one more beat. Then he turned and the operation completed itself around her. Ricci removed, the documentation secured, the 3 minutes elapsed, and through the warehouse's large front doors she could see the blue and red of federal vehicles outside that had not been there 40 minutes ago. She walked to the western wall. The partition was empty now. The people who had been there were outside, in the air, in the hands of people whose job was to do what came next for them. She stood in the empty space and looked at the concrete floor and the temporary barriers and the single blanket that had been left behind, and she stood there for a long time, breathing slowly, letting the adrenaline find its way out of her body the only way it could, gradually, with the particular exhausted shaking of aftermath. She did not cry. She had cried, in her life, in more appropriate settings, over much smaller things. She didn't cry now because there wasn't room for it yet. The space was still too full of everything that had happened, and she needed to be on the other side of tonight before she could afford to spend that. She walked out of the warehouse. The night outside was cold and bright with emergency lighting, with the specific organized noise of multiple agencies doing their respective jobs in a space that had just become a crime scene of considerable significance. She walked through it and no one stopped her, because she was wearing a vest with DeLuca International stenciled on the front in the kind of move that had apparently been standard preparation on someone's part, and she walked until she found a space at the edge of the lot near the water where the noise was slightly less and the air moved, and she stood there and looked at the East River and breathed. She heard him behind her before he spoke. "It's over," Raphael said. She didn't turn around immediately. She kept her eyes on the water. "Is it?" "The federal team has Ricci. The documentation you built is in their hands. The Montreal and Chicago and Miami people will be dealt with through the proper authorities over the next—" He stopped. "It's over." She turned. He was standing 3 feet from her, and he looked, for the first time in the 7 weeks she'd known him, for the first time since she'd watched him move through his office with the unhurried authority of a man to whom time deferred, he looked tired, not physically broken, not diminished, but carrying the specific weight of a night that had cost something real, in the particular way that nights like this always cost something that didn't appear on any balance sheet. There was a cut above his left eyebrow. She hadn't seen him get it. It had bled at some point. There was a dried line of it along his temple, and now it had stopped. But it was there, and she looked at it, and then looked at his face. You're bleeding, she said. I know. Did someone look at it? It's fine. That wasn't my question. He held her gaze. Something on his face. The tiredness, and underneath it, the thing she'd caught in the vehicle before the warehouse. The unguarded thing. It was back, and this time it wasn't going anywhere. No, he said. No one looked at it. She looked around the lot. One of the agency vehicles had a first aid kit mounted on the exterior. She'd registered it on the way out. She walked over, pulled the kit from its bracket, came back. He watched her do this. She opened the kit. She found what she needed: gauze, antiseptic, tape, and she looked at the cut, which was small but deep at the center, the kind that bled significantly for its size. Hold still, she said. He held still. She cleaned the cut. He didn't react to the antiseptic, not even the slight involuntary tightening that most people produced, just kept looking at her face while she worked. She could feel the quality of that attention, had felt it in different registers since the first morning. And she worked carefully, because she was careful, because carefulness was one of the few things she'd always been reliably good at. She applied the closure strip. She pressed it into place with 2 fingers, held it for a moment to ensure adhesion. She didn't step back. They were close enough that she could see every detail of his face in the cold emergency light, the dark water of his eyes, the particular lines at the corners of them, the cut she'd just closed, the tiredness she'd just named. Ask me now, she said. He looked at her. You said when it was over, she said. You said ask me when it's over. I said I'd ask you, he said, whether you stay. I know what you said. He was very still. Molly, I'm going to stay, she said. I've been going to stay since approximately week 3, when I found the Montreal discrepancy and brought it to you instead of walking out the door. I just needed to know whether you knew that. She paused, and whether it was a decision you wanted me to make. He looked at her for a long time. Long in the way that his silences were sometimes long, not empty, not hesitating, but full, holding something that he was selecting with care. It's the only decision I wanted you to make, he said, freely, without obligation. It is free, she said. That's what I'm telling you. He put his hand up and touched the side of her face, not the injured side, not the cut, but her face, the angle of her jaw, the way you touch something you'd been watching from a distance for long enough that touching it felt like a completion rather than a beginning. It was brief and deliberate, and she felt it in her sternum. She put her hand briefly over his, the same way she'd done across the table in the 14th floor room. And then they both lowered their hands, because there was still work to be done, and they were both people who did their work. The weeks that followed were the strangest and, in some ways, the most clarifying of her life. Ricci's arrest produced ripples that moved through the structure of New York's criminal and semi-criminal landscape with the particular violence of something long overdue. The federal case, when it became public 3 weeks after Greenpoint, was the kind of case that generated significant coverage, not because the logistics were unusual, which they weren't, but because of the scope of the infiltration operation that had been running alongside the port scheme, and because of the number of organizations that had been manipulated by a single patient and methodical hand over 6 years. The ghost cargo documentation, Molly's cross-reference, her map, her 83 minutes of focused work in a windowless room on the 14th floor, was cited in the indictment, not by name, as financial analysis provided by a cooperating source. She read this in the federal filing, which she obtained through a public access database at 1:30 in the morning in her apartment, and she sat with it for a while. Cooperating source. She thought about what category that put her in. She thought about it for a couple of nights, in the way she thought about things that mattered, carefully, looking at it from multiple angles, not avoiding the edges. She decided the category was accurate and that she was all right with it. The Montreal situation resolved over the following month with the particular grinding thoroughness of institutional processes. Paletti in Chicago. Reyes in Miami. Nadia Voss, who turned out to have been operating under a different name in 2 prior positions, which explained some things about the thinness of her file. All of them processed through channels that were, for once, the official ones. Sal Ferretti disappeared from public record. She didn't ask what that meant. She had learned, over 8 weeks, the precise shape of what she was willing to know and what she wasn't, and she held that shape carefully. Vincent Caruso, not Frank Doyle, she'd finally stopped having to correct herself, appeared at the 43rd floor once, 3 weeks after Greenpoint. He came alone, without the delegation, and he sat in the boardroom with Raphael for 40 minutes and then left. She didn't know what was said. When Raphael came out, he went directly to his desk and worked for 2 hours in complete silence. And she worked at her desk in complete silence. And at the end of those 2 hours, he came to her door and said, "Caruso is going to hold the Greenpoint corridor. The Eastern arrangement is back on the table. On terms that work for you," she said. "On terms that work for both of us," he said, "which is different from before." She looked at him. What changed? "We both know what the alternative looks like now," he said. "Neither of us wants it." She thought about the warehouse, about Ricci's eyes moving to the people against the western wall, about the blanket on the concrete floor. "Good," she said. "Mog." The croissants continued. Every morning, white paper bag on the corner of her desk. She never mentioned them. He never mentioned them. They existed in the space between acknowledgement and habit, which was, she was beginning to understand, the space where most of the things between them lived. She reorganized the accounting structure for 2 additional subsidiaries, built a new vendor reconciliation system that caught 3 smaller irregularities over the following month. None of them deliberate, all of them the ordinary human errors of people moving numbers under time pressure, and trained a new junior staff member named Priya, who was 23 and terrifyingly competent, in the specific art of cross-referencing things that weren't meant to be cross-referenced. Priya asked her in the second week of her training what had happened to the office's previous filing system. "It was inefficient," Molly said. "It looks like someone rebuilt it from scratch." "Someone did?" "Who?" Molly looked at the girl. "Someone who was new and had too much time to think and not enough context to know what she wasn't supposed to touch," she said. "Do the vendor cross-reference I showed you yesterday and flag anything where the payment terms don't match the contract date." Priya did the vendor cross-reference. She was going to be excellent at this job. It was a Tuesday in November, 10 weeks after Greenpoint, when Domenico Caruso came back to the building. She didn't know he was coming. It wasn't on the calendar she had access to, which told her something about how that relationship had evolved, about the layers of arrangement that operated above the calendar. He arrived with 1 man, not 4, and the single man was Vincent, which told her something else. She greeted them. She showed them to the boardroom. She poured water. Caruso looked at her as she set down the glasses, the same way he'd looked at her both times before, with the assessing intelligence that had not softened with familiarity. "You're still here," he said. "Still here," she said. "I expected—" He stopped. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but the predecessor of one. "He's not easy." "No," she said. "But you stayed." She looked at the old man. She thought about the 72 days she'd been in this building, about the things she'd found and the things she'd seen and the things she'd run toward when all the sensible instincts in her body were screaming the other direction. "I stayed," she said. Caruso looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, with the quiet conviction of a man making a formal statement, "He's better with you here." She looked at him. "He's more careful," Caruso said, more considered. Less, he searched for the word. Closed. He picked up his water glass. "In 40 years of knowing Raphael De Luca's family, I have not seen that before. In anyone." She didn't respond. She thanked them for coming, told them Raphael would be in momentarily, and left the boardroom. She stood in the corridor outside for a moment, her hand flat on the wall, breathing. She stayed. The evening that changed the shape of things came without announcement. It was a Friday in late November, 7 o'clock, the floor almost empty. She was finishing a reconciliation report she wanted to complete before the weekend. Raphael was in his office. She could see the light under the door, which meant he was still there. Most evenings, she knew the difference between the light when he was at his desk and the light when he'd left it on and gone. But tonight, it was the first kind. She finished the report. She saved it. She stood up and put on her coat and knocked twice on his door. "Good night," she said. He looked up from his desk. He looked at her in the way he'd looked at her 140-something times across the accumulated evenings of their working life. Steady, direct, slightly too long for the ordinary workplace transaction. But tonight it had something in it that was different from any of the previous 140. "I'm almost done," he said. 20 minutes. She paused. "Okay." She took off her coat and sat back down. She was not sure why. She hadn't been asked to stay. He hadn't requested anything. She just sat back down, and he went back to his desk, and they were both in the building together in the particular quiet of a Friday evening when the rest of the world had somewhere else to be. 22 minutes later, his office door opened fully. He came out. He had his jacket and his coat. He stood at the edge of the outer office and looked at her, and she looked at him. "You didn't have to wait," he said. "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you hungry?" She thought about it. She had not eaten since noon, which she hadn't registered until this exact moment. "Yes," she said. "There's a place on West 48th, he said. "Quiet. Good food. The owner knows me." She looked at him. She thought about all the versions of what that sentence could mean, coming from this man, in this context. She thought about all the things she knew about him, and all the things she still didn't, and about the category of things you knew versus the category of things you decided to trust, and how those categories weren't the same and didn't need to be. "Is it the kind of place," she said, "where I need to be worried about my coat knocking something over?" He looked at her. "The kind of place where if you knock something over," he said, "I'll tell them to add it to my bill." She picked up her coat, she put it on. She picked up her bag. She walked to the elevator. He walked beside her. In the elevator, going down, she noticed that the silence between them had a different texture than it had carried in the very beginning. Not the charged silence of two people calibrating, not the careful silence of people maintaining professional distance. Just the ordinary quiet of two people going to dinner, which was both simpler and more significant than either of them acknowledged. The lobby, the revolving doors, the November city, cold and bright and moving. He walked beside her on the sidewalk, not close, not distant, the appropriate uncertain distance of something that was becoming what it was in its own time. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The first day," she said, "when I spilled the espresso, every person in that building expected you to fire me." "Yes." "You didn't." "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Their breath made small clouds in the cold air. The street noise of West 48th surrounded them, the particular energy of a Friday city evening. "Because you offered to sell your belongings," he said, "to pay for a suit belonging to a man you'd known for 7 minutes, in a situation that was genuinely an accident." He paused. "I've spent my entire professional life surrounded by people who calculated everything, who never made a gesture that didn't serve a specific purpose." He looked at the middle distance ahead of them. "You offered to sell your belongings. It wasn't calculation. It was just you." She walked beside him for a moment, letting that settle. "That's a very small thing to base a decision on," she said. "The important decisions usually are," he said. She thought about that. She thought about $140,000 and 3 months of back rent and a discounted pair of heels and a filing system rebuilt because she couldn't stop herself from fixing things that were inefficient. She thought about the Montreal records and the 14th floor and 83 minutes and a laptop clutched to her chest in a warehouse on a Greenpoint waterfront. She thought about a white paper bag on the corner of a desk every morning for 10 weeks without a word from either side. "You know," she said, "I'm probably always going to be clumsy." "I know. I knocked over your architectural model. I destroyed a printer. I'm still not entirely sure how." "The motor seized," he said. "The technician said it was one of the more unusual failure modes he'd seen." She laughed. It came out sudden and genuine and slightly surprised her, the way real laughter surprised her, which was why she liked it. He looked at her when she laughed. She caught it in her peripheral vision, his head turning slightly, the fraction of a glance that was not the professional assessment she'd spent 10 weeks learning to read, but something different, something private, something he didn't perform for any room. "You're going to have to be patient," she said, when the laugh had settled. "I know," he said. "I mean it. I'm going to knock things over. I'm going to find things in your books that you'd rather I didn't find, because I can't stop looking. It's just how I'm built. I'm going to—" "Molly," she stopped. "I know," he said again, quieter. "I know all of it. I've been watching you for 10 weeks. She looked at him. He looked back, in the yellow white of the streetlights, in the cold November air, on a sidewalk in Manhattan at 7:30 on a Friday evening. "Okay," she said. They walked. The restaurant was on the corner exactly as described. Quiet, warm light inside. The smell of food that had been made carefully by someone who cared about it. The owner, a man in his 60s with flour on his sleeve, came out from behind the counter when they walked in and shook Raphael's hand and looked at Molly with the particular assessment of a person who had known someone for a long time and was now seeing what that person had chosen to bring through their door. Whatever he saw, he seemed satisfied with it. He put them at a corner table. He brought bread and olive oil without being asked and said he would send out whatever he thought they should have, which was, Molly thought, either presumptuous or exactly what you wanted, depending on how much you trusted the person saying it. She decided to trust it. They sat across from each other, and the noise of the city was outside and the warmth of the restaurant was around them. And she looked at the bread and the oil and the table and the man across from it who had the most still face and the most unreadable silences of anyone she'd ever sat across from, and who had, she now understood, been reading her with complete attention since the moment she'd walked into his office and ruined his suit and offered to sell her things. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "I wasn't just being pragmatic," she said, "when I stayed. I know I said that on the first day. I said it was pragmatism." She picked up the bread. "It wasn't. I mean, it was at first, but it stopped being that pretty early." He was quiet. "I stayed because I was interested," she said, "in the work and in—" She stopped. "In the thing that was developing." He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." "Then why didn't you—" "Because it had to be your choice," he said, "without any pressure from me, without obligation or circumstance." He paused. "What you decided had to be completely yours, or it meant nothing." She held his gaze. She thought about the 14th floor room and "I won't let anything happen to you and come back," and about 10 weeks of croissants that were never mentioned, and about the 3 seconds of his hand against her face in the cold light outside a warehouse in Greenpoint. "It's mine," she said. "I'm telling you it's mine." The food came. They ate. They talked. Not about work, not about Ricci or Caruso or Montreal or Ghost Cargo, but about other things, smaller and realer things, the kind of things you learned about a person when the professional context was finally set aside and what remained was just two people at a table. She learned that he'd grown up partly in Rome and partly in a city in New Jersey that he described in 2 words and no detail, but with a tone that told her the detail mattered and that she'd learn it eventually. She learned that he read obsessively. She'd known this from the bookshelves, but the specific things he read were more unexpected than she'd anticipated. She learned that he didn't sleep well, which she'd suspected, and that he'd started leaving early enough to stop at the bakery on West 50th himself, rather than having someone else do it, which she had not known. She told him about Harbridge and Cole, the full version, not the careful interview version. The 3 years of watching things be done wrongly, and the 6 months of finding the irregularity and the specific moment when she'd realized that being right was going to cost her exactly what it cost her. She told him about the 41 applications and the 4 interviews and the 2 final rounds and the words slightly more aligned with our current needs. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, without the reflexive sympathy noises that most people deployed to signal they were paying attention. He just listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Their loss was significant." She looked at him. "In a quantifiable sense," he said, with the faintest tone of something that wasn't quite dry humor, but was its neighbor. "I can demonstrate it mathematically, given your contribution to the organization in the 10 weeks you've been there." She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed again. The real kind, the surprised kind. He watched her laugh. He didn't look away. After dinner, outside on the sidewalk, their breath in the cold air, the city doing its Friday night work around them. She stood and thought about the subway and her apartment and the next morning, and he stood beside her and they both looked at the street. "I'll walk you to the station," he said. "It's 3 blocks." "Yes." They walked 3 blocks. At the station entrance, she stopped. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she'd finally, after 10 weeks, learned to translate. The stillness that meant something warm underneath, The controlled surface over what she now understood was not coldness, but the specific caution of a person who had operated for so long in a world that punished openness, that the habit of concealment had become structural. She looked at him and thought, I can be patient. I was built for detail work. Good night, Raphael, she said. Good night, he said. He said her name after it, the way he sometimes did, the specific naming. She went down the stairs. At the bottom, she stopped and looked up. He was still there, standing at the top, looking down. When she looked up, he didn't look away or pretend he hadn't been watching. He just held her gaze from the top of the stairs in the November cold, with the city going past behind him. She raised one hand. He raised his. She went through the turnstile. She got on the train. She stood in the crowded car with her hand on the overhead rail the way she'd stood on the night she'd first read his message, 10 weeks ago, a different version of herself in some ways and exactly the same in others. And she thought about what Caruso had said. He's better with you here. She thought about that. The train moved through its tunnel and the lights of the station strobed past, and she thought about a filing system rebuilt in an afternoon and a pattern found in 40 minutes and a laptop clutched to her chest in a burning warehouse because her body had moved before her mind caught up, because that was the kind of thing her body did, apparently, when something mattered enough. She thought about white paper bags in 10 weeks and a man with still eyes who had watched her carefully and said, I want to see which one is real. The train pulled into her stop. She got off. She walked home through the cold. She unlocked her door and went inside and set her bag down and stood in her kitchen for a moment in the quiet of her apartment. She thought about Molly Bennett, 26 years old, 4 minutes late to an interview, discount heels, 3 months of back rent, espresso launching off a tray in a clean arc toward a $10,000 Italian suit. She thought about what that morning had set in motion. She went to her kitchen. She made tea. She sat at the table where she'd once opened an encrypted USB drive at midnight and told herself she was just being pragmatic. She thought, I wasn't. She had never been. She drank her tea. She looked at the wall, at the city sounds coming faint through the window, at the ordinary Saturday morning ahead of her, and the Monday after that, and all the mornings after that, and she felt, underneath the tiredness, underneath the 10 weeks of accumulated near misses, and found irregularities and choices made in the dark, something that was solid, something that sat in her chest with the specific weight of things you'd earned rather than things you'd been given. She was still here. She had always been going to stay. She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup and set it in the rack to dry. She went to bed. She slept. For the first time in 10 weeks, she slept through the night without waking at 3 a.m. to run numbers in the dark. Outside, the city went on doing what the city did. Relentless, enormous, indifferent to the small, specific weight of two people finding each other in the middle of it. The empire held. The work continued. And somewhere across Manhattan, in an apartment she'd never seen, a man who did not sleep easily was, for once, asleep. The morning would come. The files would be waiting. The white paper bag would be on the corner of her desk before she arrived. Some things, once started, simply continued. Not because they were inevitable, but because the people inside them chose, each morning, to continue them. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.